Welcome back. Hey, my dear friends, tonight we're unlocking a door most people will never even see. A door tucked beneath the marble and gold of Vatican City. Behind it, centuries of sealed parchment, faded ink, and silence, thick enough to weigh down a soul. This isn't a conspiracy tale. It's something older, quieter, and stranger. The Vatican Archives aren't just records. They're memories the world wasn't meant to hold. Stories of whispered absolutions, forgotten saints, and paintings that saw too much. Some truths were hidden to protect the faithful, others to protect the Church itself. If you find yourself drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between faith and power. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There is a door in Rome that does not appear on any map. It does not wear a sculptor's pride or a saint's name. No angel points it out. It keeps its place in the shadow of the dome, where the limestone cools, even at noon, and the tourists pass with cameras raised to everything but this. If you stood before it, you might think it led to brooms and rags, to a corridor for men who carry buckets and learn to walk without leaving footprints on marble. That is the trick of it. The holiest rooms in Rome are not always gilded. Some are disguised as errands. When I first came to that door, I did not come as a scholar. My badge did not flash any Latin. It said custodial, caretaker, a word that means to watch, to keep, to hold. I learned where the light switches hid, which hinges complained, which stones remembered winter. I learned that in certain hallways you lower your voice, even if you are alone, because silence is not absence here. It is a tenant, and it expects courtesy. After a week, I could have found that door blindfolded, not because of signs, but because of the way the air changes as you approach it, drier, older, as if the centuries have their own climate. People speak of the Vatican's secret archives, and smile the way people smile at storms from distant hills. They say the word secretum, and picture vaults that hiss, lights that flash red, shelves that roll away to reveal forbidden things. The first lesson is simpler and more difficult. Secretum does not mean scandal. It means belonging to one person, private, set apart, the Pope's own. But time does tricks with language, and privacy grows antlers when it sleeps in a palace of glass. What began as the papal filing cabinet was mistaken for generations as the Church's locked box of shame. The mistake is tempting. It explains more than it should. But the truth, the older, quieter truth, is that the archive is not where the Church hides what it cannot defend. It is where the Church keeps what it cannot yet bear to speak. Walk with me past the door. It opens without ceremony. No trumpet of air, no smell of ozone, just the soft resignation of old hinges and the cool breath of rooms that have traded sunlight for permanence. There are no stained glass windows here, none of the jeweled light that teaches children to love heaven. The walls are simple, the floors honest. The shelves reach like disciplined forests, upright, repeating, patient. The labels are not theatrical, they are precise. You will not find a drawer-stamped mystery in gold. You will find dates, hands, languages, and the exact shade of restraint. The first corridor teaches you how to listen. Paper has its creaks, ink, its hush. Whenever a scholar turns a page, a century turns with it, and something in the air changes shape. In these halls, time does not rush. It arranges itself. Papal briefs and village letters keep company in the same climate. A decree that changed the fate of a nation sleeps 3 shelves below a mother's plea, asking for a priest to bless the bed of a dying child. The archive accepts them without hierarchy, because what decides a document's survival is not grandeur, but the careful, tenacious belief that memory itself is an act of mercy. No one warns you how heavy mercy can be when it is bound in parchment. There is a kind of weight that does not bruise, only lowers the shoulders, imperceptibly, year by year, until a man who thought he carried keys discovers he has been carrying winters. I used to move quietly with carts along the narrower aisles, delivering boxes to scholars whose eyes had learned to smile without their mouths. On slow afternoons, after the footfalls dissolved and the lamps grew subdued, I would pause with a cart and feel the seam between the past's breath and my own. Not to open anything. I had neither the right nor the arrogance, only to acknowledge the company of pages that had outlived the hands that wrote them, and the arguments that once made them dangerous. That is how the door remakes you, not with revelations, but with patience. The archive does not seduce with sensation. It invites you to notice how many of history's catastrophes are recorded in careful hands, how many of its miracles are folded, how many of its apologies were written but never sent. It is not a museum of trophies. It is a ledger of hesitation and a monastery of decisions. The air tastes of ink, long finished, and of dust that keeps its promises. In my 3rd month below ground, the first real whisper appeared. A drawer left a finger's width, opened by a scholar whose mind still stood in the 15th century, showed the corner of a folder without catalogue code or seal, only a clipped note on its cover, as plain as a winter window. This is not for history yet. I did nothing dramatic. I did not draw breath like a thief. I slid the drawer shut with reverence and moved on. But the sentence walked with me. It walked me home. It sat at my table. It asked the question that humbles any place that keeps records. When is a truth old enough to be harmless? And who decides? There are rooms here that few visit, even among those permitted to read, because reading them requires more than credentials. It requires an appetite for ambiguity. One chamber keeps the files that are not exactly denials and not exactly confessions. They are pauses. You can tell by the marginalia, the words deferred, reserved, reconsider. Another chamber is organized not by subject or language, but by temperature and darkness, where the fragile things sleep. Items that cannot survive curiosity itself. Waxes that remember fingers. Inks that ghost if you breathe on them unwisely. Vials of ash labeled only with a year that rings like a gavel. I once watched a conservator lift a slip from a wooden box marked 163 and set it on felt as if he were returning a bone to a body. We said nothing. Words would have been rude. If you want a definition of the archive that does not wilt under scrutiny, use this. It is the memory of an institution that has decided to remember even what it cannot use. It keeps victories because victories teach, and it keeps failures because failures warn. It keeps the letters that were answered and the ones that came back as silence. It keeps the drafts where sentences were crossed out and crossed out again, where a writer's hand trembled just enough to confess that certainty was an ambition, not a condition. It keeps the maps that were right and the ones that were wrong, but necessary. It keeps the saints who became official and the ones who lived like saints and were set gently aside because their miracles were not tidy, their visions not photogenic, their mouths too honest for calendars. I learned the word restraint here, the way a gardener learns the word season. The church does not destroy easily, it delays. That is its most misunderstood virtue and its most dangerous habit. Delay can be wisdom, the refusal to harden a position before the facts have finished arriving. Delay can also be fear, wearing good shoes. In these corridors, you will find both, and sometimes they hold hands so convincingly that even the most seasoned scholar cannot pry their fingers apart. That is why the lamps are modest and the chairs plain. Ornate rooms breed ornate sentences, and there is no room for those here. The archive believes in nouns, dates, hands, seals. It trusts verbs only after they have waited long enough to forget their pride. There is a shelf where the folders are bound in linen rather than leather, thinner than their neighbors, labeled with a code that smells of discretion. They are the quiet dossier of images that were never hung. A student of a master drafts a saint whose eyes do not adore but accuse. A wash of ink shows a pope not blessing, but bracing his hands on a bench, like a man enduring an earthquake. These are not heresies in pictures. They are truths the Church did not know how to share. So they were not burned, they were wrapped. The difference between erasure and postponement is the difference between an institution that fears time and one that trusts it. Not everything below is ecclesiastical theatre. There are bills, there are shipping receipts, stained with snowmelt, from years when the Alps did not forgive. There are inventories, written by men whose hands cramped with worry as crates were carried out, under foreign flags, and returned under terms brokered in rooms without windows. There are notes that smell faintly of salt, as if the sea had argued with them and lost. There are family names you will never see in textbooks, names that wrote to Rome because they had no one else to write to, and Rome, to its credit or its cunning, kept their letters, even the ones that would embarrass her if they were read on the steps of a basilica. Sometimes in the evening, when the last reader signed her exit in the log, and the felt stood like a small green field before an unmade pasture of shelves, I would sit on a low stool and let the quiet do the talking. You can hear the building think then. It is not a sound, not precisely. It is a kind of agreement between stone and time. If anyone tells you archives are warehouses, smile the way you would at a child explaining thunder. A warehouse stores things. An archive keeps promises. That is harder. That requires imagination without mythology, humility without cowardice, the courage to leave an envelope sealed because opening it would give you an answer and take away a question you did not yet deserve to ask. People ask about secrets. The word sells. It flatters the listener as a conspirator. But what lives here under lock is not a cache of thrillers. It is something more demanding, a catalogue of burdens, the file that proves a leader hesitated when he should have spoken, the draft apology that never reached daylight because the time was not yet bearable, the visionary whose message was beautiful and inconvenient, on the same page, the miracle investigated with reverence and filed with worry, the drawing that was truer than the doctrine could comfortably allow, the map that says a path existed where the story insists there was none, the letter that begins, "Dear God," and never decides who in Rome or heaven might answer. I have seen scholars lift a page and then sit for minutes with their hands empty, as if they had held a bird and needed to show their palms to themselves to prove they had not crushed it. I have watched priests read, close their eyes and mouth, a prayer that looked less like certainty than like consent, to history as it was, not as they wanted it. I have seen a curator place a fragment of wax back into a box and fasten the latch with both hands, not because the contents were dangerous, but because the touch itself was a privilege that needed a ritual to end it. Does this place redeem its own silences? Not always. The Church's restraint has saved it from foolishness and cost it its courage, sometimes within the same decade. But the archive's honesty is this: it does not edit the cost. It keeps the receipt. Even when an institution chooses to delay, it leaves a date in pencil, somewhere in these corridors, to admit that the delay occurred. I have come to think of those pencil dates as the Church's truest relics, small, undecorated, exactly the shape of a human being's fear. On certain mornings, when the bells above called the city to attention, and the first shoes made their soft conversation with the stones, I would unlock the door again, and feel an odd tenderness for the hours ahead. There is work to be done here that will never be named. A page will be flattened, a corner mended, a binding coaxed back to trust. A letter will be retrieved for a pair of careful eyes, then returned to its sleep. Perhaps nothing capital H historic will occur. Perhaps the world will remain outside noisy and proud, not caring what patience accomplishes beneath its feet. That is fine. There are vocations that depend on applause, and there are vocations that depend on breath. The archive belongs to the second kind. If you listen long enough, you will hear the sentence that runs like a watermark through these rooms. The Church remembers everything. It does not mean the Church tells everything, or that it tells it when we wish. It means there is somewhere behind a lock that is less iron than discretion, a shelf where what could not be spoken is kept until it can be borne. And if that promise feels infuriating, consider the alternative. Forgetting is a luxury reserved for the unaccountable. Whatever else the Church has been in its long performance of power and prayer, it has not let itself forget. The door without a name is proof. Once, as I was turning out the lamps, I paused before the first hinge of the first room and looked back. The long aisles held their breath like a choir waiting for a conductor's hand. For a moment, it felt as if the place looked back at me thousands of pages with a single gaze. I thought of the note on the unmarked folder. This is not for history yet. Our century too writes those notes. We like to imagine we are braver than our predecessors, but the drawer is always there, slightly open, asking a future we will not live to see, to forgive us for what we could not yet say aloud. I locked the door and climbed into the daylight, where the dome reigns and the tourists raise their cameras to the sky. None of them turned toward the shadow I had left. That is as it should be. The archive is not a stage. It is a vow, a caretaker's first glimpse. I had been in the Vatican Archives only a short time when I learned that silence has 1,000 shades, and that some doors open not onto hallways, but onto questions. My role, when first appointed, was humble, almost invisible, to sweep the marble floors at the hour when footsteps are few, to carry documents from one scholar to another, to unlock cabinets with brass keys, so old their teeth were nearly worn smooth. I thought it would be work without incident, work designed for someone who wished to serve without leaving a mark. But it was here, in this shadowed underworld beneath St. Peter's dome, that I began to see how memory itself is guarded, and how history is sometimes wrapped not in chains, but in patience. At first my days were unremarkable. The stone corridors had a rhythm all their own. Morning began with the sound of locks turning, the scrape of chairs being drawn to reading tables, and the faint rustle of pages as scholars began their ritual of unearthing centuries with their fingertips. My job was to move among them unnoticed, to oil hinges so drawers opened without a groan, to carry carts stacked with boxes tied in ribbon, to ensure that the lamps glowed steadily so that ink could be read without strain. I became in those weeks a shadow among shadows, a custodian of dust and order. But even in silence, the archives speak. It was there, in a corner few visited, that I encountered the first true whisper of the work I had joined. I had been tasked with retrieving a box of correspondence from the 17th century, letters concerning a dispute between bishops in France. It was routine, the sort of errand given to a newcomer still learning how to navigate the labyrinth of shelves. Yet when I arrived, I noticed one drawer not fully closed. Its brass handle jutted out slightly, like a finger beckoning me nearer. I thought little of it at first. Scholars sometimes forgot to close their work properly in their haste to follow a thought. But as I slid the drawer shut, my eye caught the corner of a folder without any of the usual cataloguing codes or papal seals. The cover was plain, unmarked by official hands, but across it, in careful Latin, someone had written, "Hoc nandum historiast." This is not for history yet. I froze. The words seemed to tilt the air itself. For a long moment, I simply stood there, my hand still resting on the wood, feeling the weight of what I should do. The archive is governed by rules stricter than liturgy. A caretaker is not permitted to open or read. Our task is service, not study. And yet the phrase echoed in my mind with a gravity that made me forget the dust on my fingers. Not for history yet. The drawer closed with a soft thud, but the sentence did not close with it. It followed me into the stairwell, into the refectory, into the quiet of my narrow bed at night. What does it mean for truth to wait? The question would not leave me. I had been raised to believe that history is a river flowing forward, carrying all it touches into the sea of memory. But here, beneath Rome, I found that the river could be dammed, slowed, held in check. Some truths are not erased, they are postponed. And in that postponement lies a philosophy as old as the Church itself. That revelation is not always the duty of the present, but sometimes the gift of the future. The next day, when I returned to my work, I began to look differently at the folders and boxes I handled. I noticed that some bore ribbons of a different color, as if to mark them for an audience not yet born. Others carried no seal at all, only a date or a name scrolled in a less formal hand. They seemed to whisper the same message as the folder I had glimpsed. One day, but not today, I realized that what I had stumbled upon was not an isolated note, but part of a larger practice. The Vatican does not throw away what it fears, it waits. That waiting became clearer in the weeks that followed. I observed how scholars approached their work not with the urgency of treasure hunters, but with the reverence of pilgrims. They requested boxes, as if asking permission from the centuries themselves. Some emerged pale, their eyes heavy with what they had read. Others carried faint smiles, as though they had been given a riddle rather than an answer. Once I watched a woman return a set of letters, pause, and bow her head in silence before leaving the room. Her lips moved, as if in prayer. She had not found scandal. She had found something heavier, the burden of voices that had waited too long to be heard. It dawned on me then that the archive is not simply a storage house. It is a second confessional. The first confessional is for sins spoken aloud, forgiven, forgotten. The second is for truths, too fragile to bear sunlight, too volatile for doctrine, too haunting to entrust to the pulpit. Here forgiveness is not sought. Here the goal is preservation. Every folder is a whispered admission, every drawer a hushed absolution. The Church, in its wisdom or its fear, gathers what it cannot answer and sets it aside. Not destroyed, but delayed, as though saying, not yet, not now. This realization changed the way I moved through the corridors. I began to feel the weight of every box I carried, not as paper, but as burden. A letter could weigh as much as a cathedral. If the hand that wrote it had trembled with doubt, a sealed decree could carry the silence of thousands if it remained unpublished. Even a map could bend the air around it, if it charted a path history had chosen to deny. I learned to walk carefully, not for fear of breaking parchment, but for fear of disturbing patience itself. The phrase, "not for history yet," became a refrain in my thoughts. I heard it in the echo of my footsteps, in the turning of keys, in the soft click of a drawer. I began to wonder, who decides when history begins? Is it the Pope who alone holds the final authority to release or withhold? Is it the archivists who catalogue with such meticulous restraint? Or is it time itself, moving at a pace no human can control? Perhaps the folder I glimpsed will be opened in a century, perhaps never. But until that day, it waits, like so many others in the shadowed silence of the vault. My role as caretaker gave me no right to open what I saw. Yet, it gave me something else. Perspective. I became the silent witness to the way truth is handled. Not as weapon, not as spectacle, but as burden. The archive taught me that history is not simply recorded. It is curated, guarded, and sometimes postponed until the world can bear its weight. In this way, silence is not absence, it is protection. One evening, as I extinguished the lamps, I paused in that same corridor where the drawer had been left ajar. The shelves stretched away into darkness. Each folder, a heartbeat waiting to be heard. I thought of the scholar who had forgotten to close the drawer, and wondered if it had been forgetfulness at all. Perhaps it was deliberate, a small act of generosity, a chance for another set of eyes to glimpse the philosophy of delay. I would never know, but I carried that moment with me, as surely as I carried the keys on my belt. From then on, I understood my task differently. I was not only sweeping dust, I was guarding questions. I was not merely unlocking cabinets. I was unlocking time itself, only to close it again, knowing that some truths are not meant for me nor for my age. They belong to a future where the air may be clearer, where the wounds of the present may have healed enough to face what was once unbearable. And so, I learned to walk slowly, to handle every page with reverence, to respect the silence that hung over every corridor. For in the Vatican Archives, silence is not emptiness. It is a vow, a promise that nothing is forgotten, even if nothing is yet revealed. The invisible library. The Vatican Archive is often imagined as a fortress of forbidden knowledge, a vault of secrets so dark they must be hidden from the eyes of the world. But the truth, I came to discover, is subtler and more unsettling. Many of the documents preserved here are not secrets in the dramatic sense of scandal or conspiracy. They are far quieter, more fragile. They are ideas placed in a kind of purgatory, not damned, not blessed, simply suspended. The Church calls these collections indices temporani, temporary indices. I came to think of them by another name, the Invisible Library. The Invisible Library is not marked by grand doors or marble thresholds. It hides in a modest chamber, its shelves lined with plain drawers and ordinary cabinets, as if trying not to attract notice. Unlike the gilded codes or illuminated manuscripts that gleam like relics, the books in this room are stripped of ornament, often bound in simple leather or even rough parchment. Yet the humility of their appearance belies their power. For here are the books that were never allowed to live. They were not condemned to fire, nor approved for light. They were placed on hold, wrapped in silence, waiting for a time that might never come. The Vatican's infamous Index Librarium Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, has a reputation as a blacklist, a tool of censorship. But the Invisible Library reveals another practice, one even more haunting. To be banned is paradoxically a kind of recognition. A banned book is known, feared, acknowledged. But the works in the Invisible Library were not feared enough to fight. They were feared enough to ignore, and in that ignoring, they disappeared. Not with the violence of fire, but with the stillness of dust. One manuscript I encountered in this section was written by a Polish Jesuit in the early 1700s. His text was not radical. It did not mock Scripture or defy the authority of the Church. On the contrary, it was an act of devotion, a careful attempt to reconcile the book of Genesis with new astronomical theories emerging from Europe's observatories. He asked humbly whether the 6 days of creation described in Genesis might be metaphorical, whether each day could in fact represent an age, a vast span of divine time, far beyond human reckoning. His conclusion was not heresy, it was uncertainty. He sought to open the door to questions, not to close it with answers. The Vatican's response was chilling in its simplicity. In a clerk's neat, impersonal hand, the margin carried only these words, "To be reviewed under quieter circumstances." That phrase, like a bell tolling behind closed doors, repeats throughout the Invisible Library. It is not a condemnation. It is not approval. It is hesitation institutionalized. It means, in essence, not now, not here, not yet. As I handled those pages, the Jesuit's words seemed to vibrate with longing. He had poured decades of study into his work, trying to preserve both faith and reason, loyalty and curiosity. He had trusted the Church to receive his offering, to weigh it, to decide. Instead, his voice was filed away, consigned to wait for centuries in silence. His manuscript was never banned, never published, never read. It became invisible, hidden not by hostility, but by caution. The cruelty of such a fate struck me deeply. To be denounced as a heretic is to enter history with fire. To be ignored is to vanish without even a cry. And yet the Vatican did not destroy his work. That to me was a paradox, both merciful and merciless. His book still exists, preserved under linen, catalogued with care, waiting perhaps for a day when the Church or the world is ready to listen. But what if that day never comes? How many voices are still trapped in that purgatory of waiting? Another folder in the Invisible Library contained a list of manuscripts that had never even reached the public eye. These were books written by priests, monks, even bishops, men who had given their lives to the broke Church, who submitted their writings with trembling hands and letters of devotion. One letter accompanied a thick manuscript on ecumenical theology, written by a Benedictine abbot in the 17th century. His pages argued that Catholicism might learn from the devotion of Protestants not in doctrine, but in personal piety, in the intensity of their prayer. He wrote with reverence, not rebellion, yet the reviewer's note was blunt, brilliant, but untimely. That single word, untimely, haunted me. It appears again and again in these files. It is sharper than a blade. It does not accuse the author of falsehood, nor praise him with approval. It postpones him indefinitely. To be untimely is to be declared a ghost before one has even died. It is to exist but not here. To be right, perhaps, but not now. It is a sentence of exile, not to another land, but to another age. An age that may, or may not, arrive. The more I read, the more I realized that the invisible library is built not of heresy, but of hesitation. These authors were not dangerous radicals, but loyal insiders, faithful men who sought only to ask careful questions or propose modest reflections. They were not punished with fire or excommunication. They were punished with delay. And perhaps that is a harsher fate, for at least the heretic's name lives on in memory, while the untimely author is forgotten, his work suspended in silence until history itself dissolves. Sometimes, though, the notes in the margins revealed a glimmer of sympathy. In one manuscript on natural philosophy, written by a Dominican friar, the reviewer scribbled quietly in Latin, moved by his courage, but cannot endorse. Another file carried a brief plea, written by the author himself. Decades of study, decades of service to God, and I beg only that my work not be lost. And beside it, the Vatican's verdict. Untimely, those pages cut deeper than any condemnation. They revealed not malice, but timidity. The Church could not denounce such faith, yet it could not embrace it either. And so the books were shelved, folded into drawers where they would gather silence for centuries. I began to think of these books as living beings. Each was a child, left on a doorstep, unclaimed, waiting in the cold. Each had a heartbeat trapped in ink, a voice that had spoken only once, and been told to wait forever. I could almost hear them whisper as I passed through the chamber, a chorus of questions suspended in mid-air. Why not now? Who will hear us? When will it be our time? The invisible library taught me something unsettling, that history is not only shaped by what is said, but by what is silenced. A single marginal note, untimely, speculative, too sympathetic to be reviewed later, can decide whether a thought enters the bloodstream of human memory or vanishes into obscurity. These decisions were not dramatic, but they were final. They reveal that history is not only a story of battles and councils, but of drawers closed quietly in the dark. What haunted me most, though, was the thought of the men behind these books. The Jesuit, who asked whether creation might unfold in ages rather than days. The abbot, who dared to find value in Protestant prayer. The friar, who reconciled theology with nature. Did they die thinking their words had been wasted? The priest was not renouncing faith. He was recording the unbearable weight of its silence. Yet amid the despair, there are flashes of resilience that shine like embers. A parish in France wrote of lighting candles in every window at night, so that the sick would not feel abandoned in the dark. Another record tells of a priest who stood at the edge of a mass grave and sang psalms over the bodies, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he could not bear to let them descend into the earth without a song. These gestures may not seem grand, but in the midst of plague, they were defiant acts of love. The archive reveals how suspicion also spread like disease. Some letters describe towns descending into violence, blaming Jews, foreigners, or women accused of witchcraft for the plague. The Vatican's responses were cautious, urging calm and charity, but the hysteria often outpaced the words from Rome. In some cases, priests themselves expressed doubt, writing, "We are told to preach mercy, but the people demand blame. If I speak against them, I may join the dead before nightfall." These words, copied into the archive, reveal the terrible position of the clergy, caught between their flock's fury and their own fear. What moved me most was that the Vatican chose to keep these records at all. They do not glorify the Church. They do not paint faith in triumphant colors. They reveal a Church shaken, trembling, often silent. And yet, the decision to preserve them is itself a confession. It is as if the Vatican is saying, we too must remember the times when faith faltered, when heaven seemed mute. In one of the most fragile folders, tucked between administrative reports, I found a small slip of paper in a child's hand. The letters were uneven, the ink faint. It read, "Father says we will see heaven soon. I am afraid. Please pray for me." No name, no date, just fear, preserved across centuries. My hands shook as I set it down. That child had died long ago, but their voice, trembling and small, still lived. The Vatican had chosen not to discard it. Someone believed even such fragile honesty was worth remembering. Standing in that chamber, I realized the archive is not only a record of certainty, it is also a record of hesitation, doubt, and grief. The plague letters remind us that faith is not always strong. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it asks questions without answers. Sometimes it survives, not in proclamations, but in the simple act of remembering. As I tied the folders shut, I felt the silence of the room pressing close. It was not an empty silence. It was full the silence of thousands of voices preserved, but unanswered. And I understood that this, too, is part of the Church's memory. Not only its triumphs, but its failures. Not only its certainty, but its silence. The Black Death reshaped Europe. It changed economies, societies, art, and faith. But here in the Vatican Archive, you glimpse something even deeper. The human soul in its most fragile state, preserved not to explain, but simply to be witnessed. And perhaps that is the most honest form of history. When I left the Temple Pestis chamber, I carried with me the weight of centuries. Those voices, trembling in ink, still spoke. They asked not for answers but for remembrance. And in the Vatican's quiet decision to keep them, they found it. The uncanonized Prophecies. The Vatican Archive has a way of humbling even the most hardened scholar. At first glance, its endless shelves and cabinets give the impression of order. Centuries carefully catalogued, history tamed by index cards and leather spines. But then you stumble upon a drawer, or a box, or a folder that resists neatness, that refuses to sit comfortably in the architecture of certainty. That is what I felt the day I encountered the collection marked Depositia non canonizzata of the uncanonized Prophecies. The cabinet was not remarkable. In fact, its ordinariness is what drew me in. Where other shelves gleamed with brass labels and ornate locks, this one bore a simple brass plate, where a nameplate had once been pried away. Its wood was scarred, dented, its keyhole scratched by centuries of turning keys. I expected little from it, perhaps administrative records, perhaps a set of minor correspondences. But when I unlocked it, I found 5 folders wrapped, not in the usual linen or ribbon, but in thin strips of black cloth. They looked less like documents than like books in mourning. I untied the first strip carefully, as though the cloth itself were fragile. Inside lay parchment, delicate and yellowed, written in a hand that shook with age. Across the top of the first sheet was a title, A Vision from the Desert. It had been penned by a hermit in the early centuries of Christianity, living in solitude in the barren wastes of Egypt. His words were fragmented, punctuated by pauses where hunger or exhaustion must have claimed him. He wrote of a city of faith that would one day tremble, not from persecution without, but from collapse within. He described walls that cracked, not from fire, but from memory itself, pressing outward. His vision trailed into silence, mid-sentence, the ink fading into nothing. In the margin centuries later, a Vatican reviewer had scrolled in neat Latin, too vague, not pursued. That was all. And yet, for reasons no one recorded, the parchment was preserved. Vague or not, someone believed it mattered enough to survive. The next folder carried a vision dated 1847. The handwriting was steadier, the language more dramatic. The visionary spoke of metal birds circling over cities that burned in silence. He had no concept of airplanes or bombs. To him, the vision was a nightmare without vocabulary. He described people fleeing through streets, choked with ash, their cries swallowed by a sky gone mute. Reading it with modern eyes, I could not help but shiver. In the Vatican margin, the response was cautious, unclear metaphor, potentially allegorical, and yet again, the prophecy was not destroyed. Another parchment bore the date 1931. The writer, anonymous, warned of a leader with no crown, but millions of voices. The image was unsettling, a figure without royal lineage, without sacred ordination, yet commanding nations with nothing but words, amplified by crowds. Reading it, I thought of the dictators who rose in that very decade, men who did not inherit thrones, but seized them through the sheer force of mass devotion. The Vatican's response was once more dismissive, too metaphorical, unstable source. But the parchment remained, filed and bound, preserved for eyes that might one day understand. The most haunting prophecy, however, came from a cloistered nun in northern Italy. Her words were brief, no more than a few lines. The stones will speak, and those who forget will hear them. She claimed to see churches collapsing from within, not by war or fire, but by memory returning by the weight of truths long hidden, forcing their way out. The Vatican's reviewer scribbled, "Too metaphorical, unstable witness," and so her vision was shelved, like the others, locked away. Yet the words clung to me long after I closed the folder. The stones will speak. I imagined cathedrals groaning, their walls crying out with secrets. I imagined history itself refusing to remain silent. What struck me most as I worked through these 5 folders was not the content of the prophecies themselves, though they were strange, poetic, and sometimes eerily prescient, but the way they were handled. The Church has always walked a careful line with prophecy. When visions reinforce doctrine, when they comfort the faithful, when they inspire devotion, they are canonized. Fatima, Lord is Guadalupe. These become woven into the fabric of Catholic life. But when visions disturb, when they hint at failure or reckoning, when they speak of collapse or silence, they are set aside, not denounced, not embraced, shelved. The uncanonized prophecies reveal something the Church rarely admits, its own uncertainty. To approve them would risk panic, division, or scandal. To denounce them might risk discarding truth. And so Rome chose a middle path. It preserved them in silence, guarding them like embers that might one day ignite. This to me is profoundly human. We imagine institutions like the Vatican as absolute, confident, unyielding. But here in these folders, you see hesitation, you see caution, you see the fear of declaring too much or too little. And you see above all, an acknowledgement that prophecy is not easily tamed. One parchment in particular, found in the final folder, contained only a single line written without date, without context, without name. When the shepherd is silent, the wolves will speak with the voice of angels. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. What did it mean? Was it a warning of corrupt leaders rising in the Church's silence? Was it a metaphor for false prophets? No one knew. No archivist had dared to interpret it. The words were simply filed, preserved for some future age that might make sense of them. I sat with that line for a long time. The shepherd is silent. The wolves speak with the voice of angels. It seemed to echo across centuries, a warning not only for the past, but for every age. When truth is hushed, lies will always find the tone of holiness. Perhaps the Vatican had preserved it, not because it believed it, but because it feared it might one day prove true. As I tied the black cloth back around the folders, I realized these were not just records of visions. They were records of restraint. The Church had chosen not to destroy them, but also not to declare them. It had chosen to wait. And waiting, I understood, is its own form of faith, or perhaps its own form of fear. The uncanonized prophecies whisper a difficult truth, that history is not only made of, certainties, but of hesitations. These visions are not dogma, but they are part of the memory of faith. They remind us that the divine may speak in voices too unsettling to embrace, too strange to share. And yet they are preserved, so that one day, if the stones ever do speak, the record will show that someone heard them long ago. Leaving that cabinet, I felt the silence of the archive differently. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of voices waiting, voices that might still be speaking, even now, to those willing to listen. The prayer of disillusionment. Among the countless shelves of the Vatican Archive, some discoveries arrive not with grandeur, but with simplicity so stark it feels almost brutal. No gilded bindings, no ancient seals, no dramatic inscriptions, just a plain envelope, yellowed with age, its edges curled, its paper thin as dried leaves. Across the front, in a hurried hand, a single word was written, Ad Missa, to whom it is not addressed. Inside was a single page, no signature, no date. The handwriting uneven, rushed, the ink darker in some strokes, as though the writer's hand had pressed harder in frustration. It was not a letter. It was not even a formal prayer in the style of the liturgy. It was something else, raw, personal, desperate, a confession without priest, a cry without congregation. The opening line was almost unbearable in its honesty. I no longer know who I speak to when I kneel. I read that line again and again, feeling the ache of centuries collapse into a single sentence. Here was not heresy, not rebellion, but exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes when belief no longer answers back. The writer described years of service, years of silence, years of watching decisions made behind closed doors, each one dressed in incense and ceremony. Yet each one felt as delay, disguise, deflection. We dress our answers in robes and incense, the page continued. But behind them I hear only delay. The words carried no anger. They were mournful, heavy, like the sigh of someone who had carried too much for too long. This was not the cry of an enemy of the church. It was the lament of someone inside it, someone who had given their life to it, and now felt the weight of disillusionment pressing them down. The final paragraph struck like a bell. If we have failed to be holy, let us at least be honest. Holiness will return when we stop pretending it never left. And then the page ended. No signature, no location, no reply, only silence. Why would the Vatican keep such a page? Why would it preserve something so dangerous, so unflattering, so vulnerable? The envelope had no seal, no sign it was ever delivered. It may have been intercepted. It may have been placed deliberately in the archive. We do not know. And yet, someone at some point chose not to discard it. Someone believed it mattered enough to be remembered. I sat for a long time with that page, my fingers trembling as I held it. It was not history in the sense of wars, councils, or decrees. It was history in the sense of a soul cracking open. It revealed what so few documents dare admit, that faith can grow weary, that holiness can feel absent, that even within the walls of the church, doubt can smolder quietly. And yet, paradoxically, the page is also proof of sincerity. The writer had not abandoned faith entirely. They still knelt. They still wrote. Their lament was not a rejection of God, but a desperate plea for truth. That perhaps is why the Vatican preserved it. Because disillusionment, when recorded honestly, is not weakness. It is a form of courage. As I studied the page, I began to imagine the life behind the words. Perhaps the writer was a priest who had served for decades, watching as bureaucracy suffocated compassion. Perhaps a monk worn down by silence, who had lost track of why he prayed. Perhaps even a bishop, torn between conscience and duty, realizing that the robes he wore no longer carried the weight of meaning. Whoever they were, they wrote not for glory, not for rebellion, but because they could not hold the weight alone. The phrasing of the prayer reveals a deep familiarity with the rhythms of the church. The references to robes, incense, holiness, these are the words of someone steeped in liturgy. The critique is not from outside, but from within, and that, perhaps, is what gives it such force. It is easier to dismiss criticism from enemies, harder to ignore the lament of those who love you. The silence surrounding the document is telling. There is no reply, no annotation, no commentary. The archive simply kept it like a stone dropped in a well. It does not echo, it simply remains. In that way, it mirrors the very silence the writer lamented, the silence of heaven, the silence of the institution, the silence that weighs heavier than any proclamation. But in preserving it, the Church admits something vital, that even its failures of faith must be remembered. To erase the page would have been to deny the reality of disillusionment. To keep it is to confess quietly that faith is not always triumphant. Sometimes it falters, sometimes it aches, sometimes it whispers in the dark, with no expectation of reply. Theologically, the page reveals something profound. It reframes holiness not as perfection, but as honesty. The writer suggests that holiness is not lost when people sin, or even when they doubt. Holiness is lost when people pretend, when appearances replace truth, when the institution dresses delay in incense. The call of the page is not for reform of doctrine, but for reform of honesty, and that perhaps is why it was too dangerous to publish, but to discard. I imagined the writer kneeling in some dim chapel, the smell of candle smoke heavy in the air, whispering prayers into emptiness. I imagined their hand trembling as they set pen to paper, pouring out what they could not say aloud. I imagined their fear that even this act might be condemned, and yet they wrote it anyway. And centuries later, I was holding it. That act of writing became in itself an act of faith. As I returned the page to its envelope, I realized something unsettling. This prayer of disillusionment may be more relevant today than when it was written. Every age struggles with silence. Every generation wonders whether its prayers rise beyond the ceiling. Every believer at some point feels the weight of pretending. And perhaps that is why the Vatican kept it not as doctrine, not as condemnation, but as a mirror. A reminder that faith is not destroyed by doubt. It is destroyed by pretense. Walking away from that drawer, I carried the words with me. If we have failed to be holy, let us at least be honest. That sentence seemed to echo through the stone corridors like a warning bell. Holiness will return when we stop pretending. It was less a prophecy than a diagnosis, less a condemnation than a cure. And perhaps that is why it was preserved, because even in its despair, it offered hope. For hope does not always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives in the honesty of exhaustion. Sometimes holiness hides not in triumph, but in confession. And sometimes the truest prayer is not, I believe, but I no longer know who I speak to when I kneel. Councils never held. Near the heart of the Vatican Archive, not far from the section dedicated to papal correspondence, there is a wooden chest so plain that one might mistake it for a farmer's trunk. Its boards are rough, darkened by centuries of air and oil. Its lock, a simple iron clasp, compared to the gilded cabinets that hold papal bulls or the polished drawers that preserve medieval treaties. It looks almost neglected, an intruder in a palace. But the handwritten tag tied to its handle betrays its importance. In faded Latin, the label reads, Memoranda interns non-sia, internal memoranda councils not held. It is a collection not of triumphs, not of declarations, but of hesitations. Within the chest are drafts, proposals, and notes for councils that were planned but never convened. They are the shadows of what could have been, ghostly gatherings of cardinals and bishops who never sat, agendas never debated, reforms never enacted. They reveal a church poised at the edge of decision, yet too cautious or too afraid to step forward. The first set of documents I opened dated to the early 1700 seconds. They described preparations for a council meant to address the growing divide between scientific discovery and church orthodoxy. The tone of the drafts surprised me. They were not hostile to science. On the contrary, some of the language was almost lyrical. One cardinal wrote, "We must not fear the movement of the stars, but learn to see the heavens as the language of God." The proposed agenda included sessions on astronomy, natural philosophy, and even the integration of new astronomical findings into theological education. Had this council taken place, it might have reshaped the relationship between the Church and the norns, centuries before Galileo's rehabilitation, but it did not. The final page bore a handwritten note in red. Perhaps the time will be right after another century. The council was postponed, then forgotten. The silence of delay proved stronger than the courage of curiosity. Another folder contained notes from the 1930 seconds. These were more urgent, more political. They proposed a council to address the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe, fascism, nationalism, the growing shadows of totalitarianism. The drafts argued that the Church should issue a declaration denouncing political absolutism, warning Catholics not to give loyalty to state over conscience. One draft even suggested that the Church publicly affirm the dignity of every human being, regardless of race or nation, as a divine truth. Reading those pages, I felt a pang of grief, for here was a Church that might have spoken against tyranny before war engulfed the world. Here were words that could have sounded like thunder in the 1930 seconds, words that might have offered courage to those struggling under the weight of oppression. But again, the council never happened. The notes end with a line scrolled in the margin: "World situation unstable, too risky, silence advised." The council was abandoned. The opportunity vanished, and history moved on without it. The chest holds many such fragments. Drafts proposing councils on colonial exploitation, on the treatment of indigenous peoples, on the role of conscience in modern democracy. Each one begins with hope, with vision, with cautious bravery, and each one ends with hesitation. Some bear the words suspended. Others simply trail off into blank pages. They are breaths never exhaled, thoughts never spoken aloud. What haunted me most about these ghost councils was not their failure, but their honesty. A church that recognized its challenges clearly. The bishops and cardinals who wrote these drafts were not blind. They saw the cracks forming, the dangers looming. They named them with clarity. But clarity is not the same as courage. Time and again, the Church chose delay over declaration. Doctrine must move slowly, power even more so. And yet, paradoxically, the decision to preserve these drafts is itself a confession. By keeping them, the Vatican admits its own silences. It does not destroy the record of hesitation. It binds it, stores it, and leaves it for future generations to find. In doing so, it preserves not only its proclamations, but its pauses. The physicality of the documents reinforces their poignancy. Some are written on parchment, others on thin 20th century paper, typed and corrected by hand. Many bear stains, wax drips, fingerprints, smudges of ink. They feel unfinished, incomplete, as though abandoned mid-thought. It is like holding a breath that never escaped. One of the most striking drafts concerned a proposal in the late 19th century. It suggested a council to address the growing influence of racial pseudoscience in Europe. The draft included a firm condemnation of theories that ranked human populations as superior or inferior. It quoted scripture, "All are made in the image of God." It even included letters from missionaries in Africa and Asia, pleading for the Church to speak against the racism they saw poisoning colonial rule. But in the margin of the final page was a chilling note, maybe interpreted politically: "Defer." The declaration was never issued. The silence of caution prevailed once again. These ghost councils reminded me that history is not only shaped by what is said, but by what is left unsaid. A single decision, not to convene, not to publish, not to speak, can change the course of centuries as much as any bull or encyclical. Silence is not emptiness, it is action, an action that often weighs heavier than words. As I read, I found myself imagining the rooms where these councils might have taken place. I pictured bishops gathered under frescoed ceilings, the smell of incense heavy in the air, voices rising in debate about science, politics, morality. I imagined declarations read aloud, their words carried across Europe, reshaping thought and conscience. And then I imagined the silence instead. The rooms never filled, the debates never spoken, the declarations never made, the empty echo of what could have been. Perhaps that is why the chest felt heavier than its size. It did not contain decisions. It contained indecision. It held the weight of what the Church chose not to face, what it chose to defer to another age. And in some cases, the chance never came again. The silence became permanent. Yet in preserving these drafts, the Vatican acknowledges something profound, that its own silences are part of its story. The ghost councils are not triumphs. They are wounds. And wounds, too, must be remembered. As I closed the chest, I noticed how ordinary it looked once again. Just wood and iron, plain and unadorned. Yet inside it lay centuries of almost moments, when the Church nearly spoke, nearly acted, nearly changed. History often remembers the councils that did happen. Trent, Nika, Vatican I. But here in the silence of the archive lies another history, one made not of declarations, but of delays, the ledgers of silence. There is a shelf in the archive that at first glance looks too orderly, too symmetrical to hold anything unsettling. Row upon row of leather-bound ledgers, their spines uniform, their bindings carefully maintained. They are not ornate, no gilded edges, no elaborate crests. Yet their precision gives them an aura of authority. They look less like history and more like law, as though every line within them carries the weight of decree. But when I pulled one down, its pages heavy and stiff, I realized these were no ordinary records. Written in neat Latin script, across the inside cover was the title, Dosus di Silencio, Files of Silence. These volumes do not record what happened. They record what was not said. Each entry begins with a date, a place, and a description of an issue. Then follows a summary of deliberations, often detailed, sometimes clinical, but every entry ends with the same refrain, written in formulaic precision. Null pronuntiatio, hoc temperat, no pronouncement will be made at this time. Here was the Vatican's most haunting category of memory. Not its actions, but its hesitations. Not its proclamations, but its silences. The first entry I studied was dated 1871. It concerned reports of abuse within a certain European religious order. Witnesses had been heard. Evidence had been collected. The Commission recorded its findings in careful detail. Testimonies, accounts of suffering, recommendations for reform. But the final line, cut like a knife. To proceed risks greater scandal than to delay. The matter is to be reviewed quietly, in due course. Up appears in later volumes. The silence was permanent. Reading those words, I felt the weight of calculation. The Church had not been ignorant. It had not been blind. It had chosen silence, weighing scandal against truth, and deciding that silence was safer. Another entry dated in the late 19th century addressed colonial violence. Reports from missionaries in Africa described forced labor, brutality against converts, exploitation masked as evangelization. The deliberations are recorded. Some bishops urging condemnation, others warning against political entanglement. The final verdict, silence. The matter will not be addressed publicly at this time. The ledger does not hide the debate. It records it meticulously, and yet it chooses silence as the conclusion. The pages of the ledger revealed more such entries. Decisions about authoritarian leaders, about the treatment of indigenous peoples, about the Church's relationship with totalitarian regimes. Each time the same rhythm, record, debate, and then silence. The justifications varied, protecting unity, avoiding scandal, preventing confusion, but the outcome was always the same. No pronouncement will be made. The most heartbreaking entry I found was dated 1943. Reports of deportations in Italy had reached the Vatican. Names were recorded, families torn apart, trains leaving in the night. A short note in the ledger, unsigned, records the decision. There is knowledge, there is no voice. We pray, but we do not speak. I closed the book slowly, my hands trembling. That sentence carried the weight of 1,000,000 silences. Knowledge without voice, prayer without proclamation, a memory preserved only in the quiet pages of a ledger, never spoken aloud. What struck me most was the deliberate nature of these silences. They were not absences born of ignorance. They were choices. Each page of the ledger is itself a kind of confession, not of what the Church said, but of what it chose not to say. It is a record of hesitation, preserved as carefully as any decree. The physicality of the volumes reinforced this impression. Their pages are crisp, their ink dark, their margins neat. They do not read like hurried notes. They read like contracts. Silence here was not a failure. It was a policy. I began to realize that silence in the Vatican's memory is its own kind of language. It is not absence. It is presence by refusal. Every no pronouncement entry is a statement in itself. It says, we knew, we deliberated, we chose silence. This unsettled me more than any scandal or secret. Scandals reveal corruption. Secrets can be unearthed, but silence is harder. Silence leaves nothing to attack, nothing to defend. It leaves only emptiness, and emptiness is indestructible. The ledgers also reveal the reasoning behind silence. Some entries cite unity. A declaration may divide the faithful, others cite politics. To speak risks entanglement with unstable governments. Others still cite theology. Better to delay until clarity emerges. None of these justifications erase the weight of the outcome. The silence remains. And yet, paradoxically, the Vatican preserved these silences. It could have erased the records, hidden the indecisions. Instead, it recorded them with meticulous care. This reveals something profound. The Church does not only remember its words, it remembers its silences. It keeps them as though even hesitation must one day be accounted for. In a sense, the ledgers are a kind of confessional for the institution itself. Priests confess their sins privately, voicing aloud what they have done or failed to do. These volumes are the Church's own confession, written not in the language of penance, but in the language of record. They admit, we chose silence. Here is when, here is why. And yet, unlike human confession, these ledgers offer no absolution. They simply preserve the silence, binding it in leather, storing it on shelves, waiting for eyes willing to see. As I turned the pages, I began to notice patterns. Silences were not random. They clustered in times of upheaval, revolutions, wars, social change. It was in moments when speech was most needed that silence most often appeared. The ledgers, then, are not merely records of hesitation. They are mirrors of fear. They reveal that the louder the world roared, the more the Church sometimes withdrew into quiet. One could condemn this easily, but sitting with those pages, I felt something more complicated. These were not records of malice. They were records of fear, of caution, of human frailty wrapped in authority. The scribes who wrote them were not monsters. They were men terrified of fracture, of scandal, of consequences too great to bear, and so they chose silence, believing perhaps that silence would preserve unity. But the ledgers whisper another truth. Silence does not preserve. Silence corrodes. The final entry I read before closing the ledger was brief, almost a whisper itself. It described a debate about whether to address reports of violence against a vulnerable community. The entry ended with the familiar refrain, "No pronouncement will be made at this time." But beneath it, in smaller, almost hidden handwriting, someone had added, "God forgive our silence." That line struck me harder than any decree, for here finally was an acknowledgement that silence itself is a burden. Someone centuries ago could not bear to let the page end with bureaucratic calm. They had to add their own plea, their own confession. And in that single line, the silence of the Church became not only institutional, but personal. I closed the volume with reverence. The leather creaked softly, the weight heavy in my hands. I slid it back onto the shelf, its spine indistinguishable from the others. To any casual eye, It was just another book in a wall of books. But I knew better. Inside it lay voices that were never spoken, words that never reached pulpits, truths smothered, not by ignorance, but by choice. The ledgers of silence reveal a side of history we rarely see. They remind us that what is not said can shape the world as much as what is declared. They remind us that silence is not emptiness, it is action. And they remind us painfully that sometimes the loudest sound in history is the one never made. The saints who never were. Deep within the restricted wing of the Vatican Archive lies a cabinet, unlike most others, where many shelves hold parchment bound in leather or yellowed scrolls wrapped in linen. This one is sleek, metallic, almost modern. Its lock is not brass, but electronic, requiring codes rather than keys. The contrast is jarring, a whisper of technology amid centuries of candle-lit memory. I was told, in hushed tones, that this cabinet was newer than most of the archive itself, installed to hold documents still considered sensitive. Inside, filed with meticulous care, are folders labeled simply "Pending Sanctification." These are the lives of men and women once considered for sainthood, yet never allowed to reach that final step. They are not condemned. They are not forgotten. They are suspended holy lives, stored behind steel and silence. The canonization process of the Catholic Church is long, deliberate, and exacting. It begins with investigation into a person's life. Were they faithful, virtuous, devout? If so, the process moves forward. The sentence leapt from the page, trembling with a kind of humility rarely associated with 17th century Rome. But at the bottom of the page, a thick red line slashed across the text. Beside it, in the margin, someone had written, "Do not publish. Await further deliberation. No further draft survives." No apology was ever issued. The Church remained silent for centuries. The breath it drew in never released. Another suspended act, dated 1892, concerned the growing spread of racial pseudoscience in Europe. The draft text was bold, even prophetic. It declared that no human population could ever be called inferior, for all were made in the image of God. It warned against those who dress hatred in the garments of reason. It quoted scripture and missionary testimonies alike, calling for the Church to denounce racism at its roots. But again, the document was never issued. In the margin, a cautionary note appears, may be interpreted politically. The fear of controversy proved stronger than the urgency of truth. The draft was folded, filed, and suspended. Another folder contained an incomplete decree from the mid-9th century, drafted in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. It acknowledged that the rapid rise of factories and mechanization had thrown millions into poverty and suffering. The draft suggested that the Church issue a statement urging fair wages, humane working hours, and protection for children forced into labor. Reading it, one could see the beginnings of what might have been a Catholic social teaching long before Rerum Novarum was published in 1891. But this earlier draft was never completed. At the bottom of the page, where a papal signature might have gone, the parchment is blank. An annotation reads, "Hold until clarity on economic impact is achieved." The urgency of workers' cries was postponed for the sake of economic calculation, and so the act was suspended. What unites these suspended acts is not failure, but fear. They reveal a Church aware of truths, but hesitant to proclaim them. Each unfinished decree bears the marks of debate, words written with conviction, then crossed out in anxiety. They show how doctrine is not only shaped by revelation, but by hesitation. How the hand of the scribe trembles when the weight of history feels too heavy. The very physicality of the documents makes this hesitation tangible. Some pages are smudged where ink was hastily blotted, as though someone had written in passion and then recoiled. Others bear holes where passages were scraped away with a knife, the parchment thinned by eraser. Some drafts end mid-sentence, as if the pen itself was abandoned. Each one feels alive in its incompleteness, a fossil of thought interrupted. Perhaps the most poignant suspended act I found was a declaration drafted in the early 20th century. It was meant to condemn the abuse of power within the Church itself. The draft admitted that authority had sometimes been used harshly, that clerical privilege had shielded injustice, that reform was needed. The words were startling in their honesty, almost revolutionary, but they were never spoken. A note at the bottom reads simply, "Too destabilizing, delay indefinitely," and so the reform that might have come sooner was silenced for generations. As I moved from folder to folder, I felt a strange ache. Suspended acts are not failures of faith, but failures of courage. They reveal a church that often knew more than it said, saw more than it admitted, desired more than it declared. And yet, because of fear of politics, fear of scandal, fear of division, it chose silence. But in preserving these drafts, the Vatican makes a kind of confession. It does not destroy them. It does not erase the record of hesitation. It binds it, files it, and places it on the shelf. In doing so, it admits that silence is part of its history, that some truths were glimpsed, but never proclaimed, that some apologies were written, but never delivered. This paradox fascinated me. On one hand, the suspended acts reveal weakness, an institution too cautious to act when action was needed. On the other hand, they reveal humility, a willingness to keep even its unfinished thoughts, to let the record of hesitation remain. The Church, in this sense, does not only preserve its triumphs, it preserves its doubts. I began to see these acts, not as failures, but as lanterns unlit. Each draft was a wick prepared, a candle waiting, never struck. They sit in the archive like dormant lights, waiting for someone brave enough to ignite them. Perhaps that is why they were kept, not to bury them forever, but to hold them until a time when the Church might finally breathe the words aloud. Theologically, the suspended acts raise unsettling questions. Does truth wait for permission? Does justice need timing? Can holiness be postponed? These drafts whisper that the Church often treats truth not as eternal command, but as fragile timing. A truth spoken too soon can divide. A truth delayed too long can wound. The archive bears the scars of both. The last folder I examined contained nothing more than a fragment, a single sentence begun and abandoned. It read, "The Church must confess." The line stops there, mid-ink, mid-thought. No continuation survives. Was it meant to confess complicity, error, silence? We will never know. But the fact that even this fragment was preserved tells its own story. The Church may not have confessed, but it remembered the impulse to confess. Closing the final folder, I felt the suspended acts press upon me like a collective sigh. They are history's unfinished prayers, words that hovered on the lips of the Church, but never found voice. And in their silence, they speak. They remind us that history is not only made of declarations, but of hesitations. That the truths we most need are often the ones left unsaid. As I placed the folders back, the dust rose in small clouds, catching the dim light. For a moment, it looked like smoke rising from extinguished candles, and I thought, perhaps that is what these acts are. Smoke from flames that were never allowed to burn. The unacknowledged phenomena, the Vatican Archive, is often imagined as a fortress of theology. Shelves lined with dogma, councils, papal bulls, the scaffolding of doctrine built across centuries, and much of it is just that, a careful architecture of belief. But buried within this immense labyrinth is a chamber that unsettles all such expectations. It does not hold theology, it does not hold law, it holds mystery. I came upon it almost by accident, walking through a narrow corridor that once served as a service passage in the old Apostolic Palace. At the far end, tucked behind a wall of diplomatic correspondence, was a small reinforced room. Its climate was carefully controlled, its light dim and metallic. Inside, neatly labeled in drawers of pale wood, was a collection marked with one simple word: Extraordinaria. The term was vague enough to invite curiosity, but when I opened the first drawer, the reality staggered me. These were reports of the inexplicable documents describing visions, apparitions, phenomena that had reached the Vatican over centuries. They came from bishops, priests, missionaries, and sometimes ordinary lay people, written in the same calm, bureaucratic style as any other report, but their content defied categories. Here were not debates of doctrine, but testimonies of wonder, miraculous healings, spectral voices, lights in the sky, prophetic dreams. And yet the most striking feature of these files was not their strangeness, but their conclusion. At the bottom of almost every report written in neat clerical hand appeared the same refrain: further investigation, unnecessary at this time. That phrase repeated again and again, like a mantra of hesitation. These events were not condemned. They were not dismissed as fraud. They were not embraced as miracles. They were placed in a liminal space, preserved, acknowledged, but left unresolved. The first report I read came from Sicily in 1678. It described a series of dreams experienced by dozens of parishioners over 7 weeks. Each dream was identical: a figure in crimson robes weeping before a burning manuscript. The local bishop sent the reports to Rome, convinced that something extraordinary was occurring. The Vatican's reply was cautious. Pastoral discretion advised. No further inquiry. The dreams faded from memory. Yet here they remain, written in ink, bound in silence. Another report, more recent, came from Brazil in the 1952. 3 nuns in a rural convent claimed to have received the same message during prayer: prepare for the unraveling of boundaries. The phrase was underlined in the Vatican copy. A question mark scribbled beside it. Was it a metaphor? A prophecy? A delusion? The official response was brief, ambiguous, no action required. But the fact that the report was preserved suggests someone somewhere believed it might matter. Reading through these files, I began to see a pattern. The events recorded here did not fit the frameworks Rome had built for miracles. They were too strange, too ambiguous, too unsettling. Apparitions that did not match Marian devotion, healings that occurred outside expected rituals, dreams that hinted at upheaval rather than comfort. They were truths that did not serve stability, and so they were locked away. One case particularly haunted me. It came from Eastern Europe during the 19th century. A village priest reported that during a funeral mass, the stone floor of the church trembled, and a low sound like chanting rose from beneath. Multiple witnesses described it the same way. The priest wrote that the congregation fled in terror, convinced the dead were speaking. The bishop, cautious, forwarded the report to Rome. The Vatican's note was unverified. No publication. Yet the document was filed carefully, not discarded. The tremor of that church floor lives still in the archive, even if it was never acknowledged aloud. Another report, stranger still, came from Africa in the early 20th century. A missionary described a night when lights appeared over a village, shifting in patterns, hovering silently above the chapel. Entire families testified to seeing them. The missionary included sketches, glowing orbs arranged in a circle, pulsing like lanterns in the sky. His report did not claim miracle or vision, only that something unexplained had occurred. The Vatican's response was almost defensive. Do not categorize. Archive only. The clinical tone of these documents is chilling. They do not dramatize. They do not speculate. They record with precision dates, witnesses, descriptions, even meteorological notes. They strip wonder into data, and then they file it away. It is bureaucracy confronting mystery. But the very act of preserving these reports reveals something profound. The Church does not throw away wonder. It keeps it. Even when it cannot interpret it, even when it fears confusion, it refuses to erase. In this way, the archive becomes not only a treasury of certainty, but also a treasury of doubt. Theologically, this is astonishing. The Catholic Church speaks often of truth, of clarity, of dogma. Yet here in these drawers, it admits that not all truths can be named. It admits that some mysteries defy its categories. It admits that silence may sometimes be safer than speech. As I read deeper, I noticed another feature, the language of discomfort. Many notes in the margins use the same words. Too ambiguous, too unsettling, too inconvenient. These events were not excluded because they were false, but because they did not fit. The Vatican, guardian of order, preferred silence to disorder. Better to let wonder sleep than to risk chaos. And yet in preserving them, the Church also admits a deeper truth, that faith is not built only on what can be explained. It is built also on the recognition that some mysteries remain untamed. The Extraordinaria files are not proof of miracles. They are proof of humility, or perhaps fear. They are the record of a church that sometimes chooses to keep questions rather than answers. One of the oldest reports in the drawer, dated to the 17th century, described a village where children claimed to hear music in the fields at night. Music with no source, no players, melodies drifting like wind. The bishop who investigated heard it himself, though faintly. He wrote, "It was as if the earth itself hummed." The Vatican, cautious as always, filed the report with the note, "Unresolved, no pronouncement." Another from the mid-10th century described a priest in Asia who dreamed repeatedly of a fire consuming his church. Weeks later, lightning struck the building and the roof collapsed. His bishop forwarded the account to Rome, noting the eerie coincidence. Rome's reply, "Premonition, not miracle. Archive only." Yet the dream was preserved as though the Church itself feared discarding it. As I handled these papers, I felt a strange reverence. These were not fairy tales. They were not pious legends. They were testimonies written with sincerity, recorded with care, preserved with caution. They are reminders that the world is stranger than we admit, and that even the most powerful institution on earth sometimes chooses silence when faced with the unexplainable. What haunted me most was this: these files are not about belief or disbelief. They are about uncertainty. They reveal a church that, for all its proclamations of truth, quietly admits that some things cannot yet be spoken. And perhaps that is why the archive keeps them, because in a faith built on mystery, even unanswered mysteries must be remembered. I closed the drawer of Extraordinaria slowly, the air cool and still. It felt like closing the lid on a box of whispers. For what is preserved here is not doctrine, but wonder. And wonder, even when unacknowledged, has a way of enduring. The index of forbidden books. The Vatican Archive is filled with chambers where history breathes quietly. But few places struck me as forcefully as the room devoted to the Index Librarium Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books. Even the air there felt heavier, as though it carried the dust of 1,000 locked libraries, the ghosts of words condemned yet never destroyed. The room itself was unlike others, where most sections bore the marks of slow decay, faded parchment, cracked bindings. This one had an almost clinical neatness. Long rows of drawers, their iron handles polished smooth by use, stretched from floor to ceiling. Each bore labels written in the same careful hand. Titles, authors, dates of prohibition. These were not casual notes. They were verdicts. For centuries, the Index Liorum Prohibitorum functioned as the Church's instrument of control over knowledge. First established in the 16th century, during the turbulence of the Reformation, it grew into a vast catalogue of books that Catholics were forbidden to read. The stated purpose was protection, shielding the faithful from heresy, error, and corruption. But reading the files, I realized the index was not merely about protecting faith. It was about managing fear. Fear of ideas too dangerous, too liberating, too destabilizing. Each entry followed a pattern. A book would be identified. Author, title, publication date. Then followed the rationale. Why it was condemned. What danger it posed. Sometimes the reasons were theological contradictions of dogma, challenges to scripture. Other times they were political advocacy of democracy, criticism of hierarchy, sympathy for rival faiths. Occasionally, the reasons seemed almost trivial, too speculative, too provocative, too untimely. Yet the paradox of the index is this. The books themselves were not destroyed. Many were quietly preserved, carefully catalogued, sometimes even rebound. The Church may have silenced them in public, but in private, it remembered them. In this way, the index became not a graveyard of thought, but a hidden library of suppressed voices. One file I studied concerned a manuscript written by a Jesuit in the early 1700s. His book explored the possibility of intelligent life beyond Earth, not as science fiction, but as theology. He asked, if God is infinite, why should his creation not also be infinite? He wrestled with profound questions. Would beings on other worlds share in original sin? Would they require redemption? Could Christ's incarnation be singular or cosmic? His tone was reverent, his faith sincere, but the Church judged the book dangerous. It was banned for introducing disruptive cosmology. And yet tucked beside the condemnation was the Jesuit's letter of defense. In it, he wrote, if our God is infinite, why should his creation not be? Is it heresy to ask, or is it worship to wonder? His plea went unanswered. He was reassigned, his book shelved, but his words endure, bound in the archive. Proof that even silenced wonder still breathes. Another file concerned treatises on democracy. During the upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries, political works advocating for the rights of citizens, the dignity of common people, and the limits of monarchies were condemned as dangerous to order. Yet reading them today, one sees not heresy, but the seeds of values we now take for granted. Freedom, dignity, conscience. The Vatican feared these ideas might weaken its authority, but instead of erasing them, it preserved them. In a strange irony, the archive became the custodian of the very voices it once sought to suppress. There were also theological works, banned not for denying God, but for asking too much of him. A book by a 19th-century nun explored the role of women in salvation history, proposing that Mary's fiat was not passive obedience, but active leadership. The censors judged her arguments dangerous to hierarchy. Her book was banned, but her manuscript, handwritten and annotated, rests still in the archive, its margins filled with the fervent ink of someone who loved God too much to remain silent. The index was abolished officially in 1966, yet its shadow remains. Reading through the files, I realized that the index was not simply about keeping the faithful away from danger. It was about shaping what questions could be asked, what imaginations could be allowed to bloom. It was about deciding not only what was true, but what was safe. And yet once again, the paradox shines through. The very institution that feared these books preserved them with care. They were not burned. They were catalogued. They were shelved. They were bound into the memory of the Church. In this sense, the archive becomes a witness to its own contradiction, condemning with one hand, conserving with the other. As I handled the files, I felt the tension between authority and wonder. The spines of the books were scarred with labels of prohibition, yet their pages whispered ideas still alive. The silence imposed on them was never total. The archive itself ensured that one of the most haunting cases involved a manuscript about interreligious dialogue written decades before the Church embraced ecumenism. Its author, a priest, argued that truth might be reflected in many faiths, that dialogue was not compromise, but enrichment. His book was banned for being too sympathetic, but here it rests still, preserved behind iron handles, its words waiting for a future that might finally be ready. Theologically, the index raises profound questions. Can truth be silenced? Can faith be protected by fear? Or does suppression only prove the power of the words suppressed? The archive does not answer. It only preserves the tension. I realized as I stood in that chamber that the index was not a record of sin, but a record of struggle. It is the struggle between fear and faith, between order and imagination, between the desire to preserve unity and the need to confront truth. The banned books reveal not a church without questions, but a church overwhelmed by them. Perhaps that is why the archive kept them, because even forbidden words have something to teach. Even silenced voices must be remembered. The index, in its strange way, is proof that the Church has always lived, not only with certainty, but with unease. And in that unease, perhaps, lies the truest story of faith. As I closed the drawer, the air seemed heavier. The silence of the chamber was not empty. It was filled with whispers of books, once condemned, now waiting for a generation bold enough to read them, wise enough to wrestle with them, and faithful enough to remember that truth does not tremble in the face of questions. The Tokugawa letters. In the great sprawl of the Vatican Archive, there is a section dedicated to diplomacy. Many expect it to be filled only with familiar names: French kings, Spanish emperors, Holy Roman envoys, and later presidents and ministers of the modern world. And indeed, those shelves are there, heavy with treaties and alliances. But among the volumes I stumbled upon something altogether stranger, a narrow drawer of correspondence marked simply Nippon, Japan. The drawer was modest in size compared to the towering shelves of European statecraft. Its folders were thin, its collection small. Yet, when I opened the first file, I realized I was holding one of the most unlikely dialogues in history: secret communications between the Vatican and the Tokugawa shogunate. Japan in the 17th century had closed its doors to the world. Christianity was outlawed. Missionaries were expelled or executed. The faithful who remained were driven underground, becoming the hidden Christians. The Kakure Kirishan, who kept their devotion alive in whispers and in symbols, disguised as Buddhist statues. The shogunate, wary of foreign influence, sought to cut the threads that tied Japan to Rome. And yet, against all odds, a correspondence existed. One letter dated 1611 stunned me. It was written in formal Portuguese, the language of trade and diplomacy, and it bore the seal of a Tokugawa envoy. Addressed respectfully to the Pope, it acknowledged the loyalty and knowledge brought by missionaries. The tone was careful, measured, even respectful, but its message was firm. Christianity, it declared, divides families and sows discord. Therefore, it could not be tolerated within Japan's borders. The letter was remarkable, not for its rejection, but for its tone. It did not mock or denounce the Church. It recognized its authority, even as it refused its presence. The shogunate, pragmatic and shrewd, was drawing boundaries: respect without submission, dialogue without acceptance. Alongside that letter, preserved in the same folder, was an undelivered draft, written in Rome. It was never sent, but it reveals how the Vatican wished to reply. The draft spoke of shared values: discipline, reverence, respect for order. It urged that faith need not divide, but could enrich. It expressed hope that dialogue might one day lead to coexistence. At the bottom of the draft, however, a note was scrolled in sharp Latin: no reply, too risky. The letter was never dispatched. Silence, once again, was chosen. The next folder contained more curious fragments: coded missives written by missionaries, smuggled through Portuguese traders, hidden inside the bases of wooden statues. They reported on the state of the underground church in Japan, small communities of believers, clinging to fragments of faith, baptizing their children in secret, whispering prayers behind closed doors. These reports were desperate, filled with both courage and fear. "We survive as shadows," one missionary wrote. But shadows, too, can carry light. Rome received these pleas, but responded with caution. Officially, the Church could not intervene without provoking greater persecution. Unofficially, it encouraged the hidden Christians through coded blessings, fragments of prayers written in disguised scripts. The archive preserves both sides of this fragile exchange: Rome's silence in public and Rome's whispers in private. One of the most poignant items in the drawer was a small parchment worn thin with Japanese, characters carefully inked. A translation was attached in Latin, a message from a community of hidden Christians, sent through intermediaries. It read, "We keep the faith though we cannot speak it. We baptize, though we cannot proclaim it. Tell the Father in Rome that though his children are hunted, they still remember his name. The reply to this letter, if it existed, is lost. But the fact that the Vatican preserved the plea at all is astonishing. It was never meant for the public eye. It was never read in St. Peter's Square. Yet here it sits, centuries later, proof that across oceans and prohibitions, the bond of faith endured. As I sifted through the correspondence, I began to understand the delicate dance both sides performed. The shogunate sought to control foreign influence without dishonoring Rome outright. The Vatican sought to preserve faith in Japan without provoking greater bloodshed. The result was not dialogue in the open, but whispers in the shadows, folded into the archive like pressed flowers, fragile, fading, but still intact. Theologically, these letters reveal something profound about the nature of faith under pressure. Christianity in Japan survived not because of Rome's proclamations, but because of ordinary believers who refused to let go. The archive holds their voices like seeds in winter, waiting to bloom again. And by preserving these fragile exchanges, the Vatican admits that sometimes faith's greatest victories are not public triumphs, but hidden endurance. What struck me most was the contrast between the two voices, the shogunate's firm, pragmatic rejection and the Vatican's hesitant, hopeful drafts. Neither side gave way. Neither side won. And yet across centuries, their words remained side by side in a drawer in Rome. Closing the folder, I felt a strange reverence. These were not grand treaties or proclamations. They were quiet exchanges at the edge of possibility, reminders that even in an age of persecution and isolation, communication persisted. They are testaments, not to victory, but to patience. Perhaps that is why the Vatican kept them not as trophies, not as shame, but as reminders. That faith sometimes survives, not through conquest, but through silence. That diplomacy sometimes means not forcing an answer, but waiting. That history is not only written in cathedrals and capitals, but in letters that never reach their destination. As I slid the drawer shut, the air seemed to sigh. For what rests within it is not simply paper, but the fragile memory of a dialogue that was never quite spoken, but never entirely broken. The Tokugawa letters remind us that even in silence, communication endures. And in the archive's preservation of them, we glimpse the Church's most difficult truth, that sometimes the holiest act is not to win, but to remember the Inquisition files. Among the thousands of drawers in the Vatican Archive, one bears a label that needs no translation. Written in stark Latin, its spine reads, Process Inquisition, the Inquisition Files. Even before I touched the wood, I felt the weight of centuries pressing against it. Few words in history carry such a burden of fear, silence, and blood. The Inquisition, established to guard the purity of faith, became one of the most feared institutions in the Church's history. It stretched across Europe, its tribunals reaching into villages and universities alike, its judgments shaping the boundaries of belief. The documents stored here are not legends, not accusations whispered in textbooks. They are the records themselves, trial transcripts, verdicts, pleas, and private notes written by the very men who sat in judgment. When I opened the first folder, I expected fire and thunder, proclamations of certainty. What I found instead was hesitation pages, filled not with zealotry, but with fear. The scribes recorded everything, the charges, the questions, the responses of the accused, and between the lines, I began to see not only the power of the Inquisition, but its torment. The most famous case preserved here is that of Giordano Bruno, a philosopher, a thinker too wide for his age. Bruno imagined an infinite universe, filled with stars and worlds beyond our own. For this, and for his refusal to retract, he was condemned and burned in 1600. The files of his trial lie here, heavy with ink and sorrow. The transcript records his interrogations, the arguments, the endless debates over words. At one point, Bruno declared, "I do not recant, for I cannot recant what I believe to be true." The inquisitors pressed him again and again, offering him chances to retract to save himself. But Bruno's defiance held. What shocked me most was not his words, but a note scribbled in the margin by one of his judges. "If we spare him, doctrine will waver. If we burn him, history will not forgive." That single line captures the agony of the Inquisition. They knew the cost of silence. They knew the weight of fire, yet they chose fire, fearing the fracture of certainty more than the stain of blood. The files also reveal something less known. Not every inquisitor desired punishment. Some argued for clemency, believing Bruno's ideas radical but not heretical. Others feared the consequences of leniency. The debates were fierce. The margins of the transcripts, filled with counter-arguments, petitions, even appeals for delay. The Inquisition, often painted as a monolith, was in fact a battlefield of conscience within the Church itself. Beyond Bruno, the files hold countless other cases, some famous, many forgotten. A priest accused of harboring Protestant sympathies, a scholar charged with translating scripture without permission, a woman accused of practicing superstition when she prayed with herbs in her hands. For each, the Inquisition recorded every word. The questions are sharp, relentless. Do you believe the sacraments are necessary for salvation? Do you hold that the Pope has authority over kings? Do you deny the miracles of the saints? The answers vary, some defiant, some trembling, some broken. One case that lingered with me involved a young man from Spain, accused of reading banned books. His defense was simple: "I read to understand, not to deny." The tribunal debated his fate for months. Some argued for leniency. Others demanded severity. The final verdict was exile, not death. His name, long forgotten, survives only here, in the fragile ink of parchment. The Inquisition files also reveal acquit. Not all accused were condemned. Some were freed after years of imprisonment. Their innocence recognized too late to restore the lives they lost. The margins of these files often carry notes of sorrow. "He was not guilty, but his faith is broken." These small phrases pierce deeper than any verdict. They reveal that even those spared bore scars that no absolution could erase. As I read through the cases, I began to see the Inquisition not as blind cruelty, but as a mirror of fear. The Church feared fracture, feared heresy, feared chaos. And in that fear, it chose severity. But fear, no matter how devout, leaves wounds. The files themselves are those wounds bound in parchment, stored in silence. What unsettled me most were the private notes written by inquisitors themselves. Some confided their doubts in the margins, admitting their unease. One wrote, "We punish not because we hate, but because we fear losing control. God forgive us if we mistake fear for faith." Such words were never meant to be read aloud. Yet they are preserved here, a secret confession written in ink instead of spoken in the dark of a confessional. There are also records of entire communities swept up in suspicion, villages accused of harboring heretics, families divided by fear. Testimonies reveal neighbors turning against neighbors, sometimes from conviction, sometimes from survival. These pages do not describe doctrine. They describe human frailty, the way fear corrodes bonds of trust. One file describes a case from northern Italy, in which several villagers were accused of witchcraft. Their crimes were nothing more than folk practices, herbal remedies, blessings for crops. The transcripts record their protests. "We prayed only for rain, only for health." But the inquisitors, wary of anything outside strict ritual, pressed them until confessions were forced. Some were punished, others acquitted, but the community was shattered. The archive preserves their voices, even when the world forgot them. Theologically, the Inquisition files pose haunting questions. What is the cost of protecting truth? Can faith survive without mercy? Is unity worth the price of silence? The documents do not answer. They only reveal the struggle. What struck me most was that the Vatican chose to preserve these records at all. It could have destroyed them, erased the memory of fire and fear. Instead, it kept them every testimony, every verdict, every whispered doubt. In doing so, the Church admits its shadows. It acknowledges that faith has not always been defended by light. As I closed the final folder, I felt the silence of the archive press around me. The Inquisition files are not merely history. They are a mirror held up to power, a reminder that fear can masquerade as faith, that zeal can drown compassion, that even the guardians of truth can tremble. The Inquisition is often remembered only for its violence, but here in the archive it is remembered also for its hesitation, its inner conflict, its confessions written in the margins. And perhaps that is the truest record. Not an institution of cruelty alone, but an institution caught between conscience and control, torn by fear, preserved by silence. As I slid the drawer shut, the weight of centuries settled back into place. The archive does not absolve the Inquisition. It does not excuse it. It remembers it page by page, testimony by testimony, voice by trembling voice. And in that remembering, it ensures that the fire of fear once lit will never be forgotten. The papal correspondence, tucked deep within the Vatican Archive, past corridors lined with the correspondence of kings and emperors, lies a smaller, heavier drawer, labeled with 2 words in Latin, correspond, private correspondence. Unlike the shelves of treaties or bulls, these documents were not intended for public eyes. They belonged to the popes alone, letters unsent, notes unspoken, pages where pontiffs set down thoughts too fragile or too dangerous to leave the walls of Rome. The drawer itself gave little warning of its significance. Its wood was unremarkable, its brass handle dulled, but inside, folded carefully, tied with faded ribbons, were letters that revealed a side of the papacy almost no one ever sees. Not the voice of authority, but the voice of men who bore authority's crushing weight. The first letter I read came from Pope Gregory X, 15th, in the early 17th century. Written in a trembling hand, it was addressed not to a monarch, nor to the Church at large, but to a brother in faith, whose name is missing. The letter spoke of sleepless nights, of the burden of choosing between peace and principle. Gregory described how the wars of religion across Europe tore at his soul. "If I speak too boldly," he wrote, "I divide the faithful. If I remain silent, I betray them." The letter ends abruptly, as though the Pope could not bear to finish it. It was never sent. Preserved in the archive, it remains a confession in ink rather than voice. Another document revealed the anguish of Pope Pius IX during the loss of the Papal States in the 19th century. In private notes written on scraps of paper, he described the loneliness of being, as he put it, a king without a kingdom. His words carried no triumph, no papal majesty. They carried sorrow. "I am shepherd to millions. Yet in truth, I wander as though exiled from my own pasture." These were not the words of a ruler. They were the words of a man wrestling with the limits of power. But perhaps the most haunting entry was a journal kept by Pope Pius I, 12th, during the Second World War. Unlike his official encyclical, which spoke cautiously of peace and justice, this private journal revealed his torment in silence. He wrote of the deportations, of the reports arriving daily, of trains filled with the condemned. He confessed his fear that to speak too loudly would provoke harsher reprisals, that to remain silent was itself a betrayal. "I carry the prayers of millions," he wrote, "but also the weight of unspoken sorrow." His words do not justify, they do not excuse. They reveal the agony of a man caught between conscience and caution. The private correspondence is filled with such moments. Letters of popes who doubted, who wept, who confessed their fears not in churches but on paper. These writings strip away the gilded vestments of the papacy and reveal men who bore the unbearable. Some of the letters are deeply personal, even intimate. One pope wrote of his loneliness in the Apostolic Palace, describing vast halls where footsteps echoed, but voices did not. Another confessed that he longed for the simplicity of his priesthood, when he could walk among the people without guards or ceremony. These were not confessions of weakness, but of humanity. They remind us that popes, for all their authority, are men first, men who pray, who doubt, who ache. What struck me most was the secrecy of these documents. None were meant for publication. Some were never even sent. And yet, the Vatican chose to preserve them. In doing so, it acknowledges that even the private sorrow of popes belongs to history, that their doubts are as much a part of the Church's story as their decrees. Theologically, these letters are astonishing. The papacy is often portrayed as unwavering, certain, a rock in the storm. But here in the archive, we see its cracks. We see that authority does not erase doubt. It magnifies it. For who bears greater fear than the one who must speak for millions? One of the shorter notes that lingered with me came from Pope Benedict V during the First World War. Written in Latin on a single sheet, it simply read, "The world is tearing itself apart, and I, who should heal, cannot mend a single wound." It was a cry of impotence, a recognition that even the highest office in Christendom cannot always bind the world's Christendom. Fractures. The private correspondence also contains moments of startling honesty about faith itself. One pope wrote, "I kneel, but some nights I do not feel heaven listening." Perhaps that is faith to pray, even when the sky is silent. To read those words, written by the very man seen as Peter's successor, was to see the human heart beneath the crown. As I closed each folder, I realized the power of these documents lies not in their theology, but in their humanity. They remind us that popes are not marble statues. They are men who wake in the night, burdened by the weight of choices no human should have to make. Their private words echo with loneliness, with doubt, with longing, and yet, by writing them, they reveal a deeper kind of courage, the courage to admit that even in the highest office, faith trembles. The Vatican could have destroyed these letters. It could have erased the memory of papal weakness. Instead, it preserved them. In doing so, it confesses that the papacy is not only authority, it is also vulnerability. And perhaps that vulnerability is what makes these men most like the rest of us. Walking away from the drawer, I felt a profound respect, not for power, not for majesty, but for fragility. For in the silence of the archive, the popes speak most honestly, not when they command, but when they confess. And their confessions, though written in secret, are preserved as part of the Church's memory. The papal correspondence is not a monument to power, it is a testament to humanity. It reminds us that even the shepherd sometimes feels lost. Even the rock sometimes trembles. Even the vicar of Christ sometimes wonders if heaven listens. And in that honesty, perhaps lies the truest strength of all, the lost masterpieces of art. There are corners of the Vatican archive that breathe with the weight of decrees and councils, shelves that rattle with the dust of centuries-old politics. But one chamber I found held a different kind of silence, one filled not with judgment or law, but with imagination frozen mid-breath. Here art itself was imprisoned. At first glance the chamber seemed orderly, cabinets in neat rows, drawers labeled with the names of chapels, artists, or commissions. One might expect them to contain only familiar relics of art history, letters of patronage, contracts, or sketches from works that still dazzle pilgrims in Rome today. And indeed, much of it is exactly that. Yet inside one modest cabinet lay something altogether different, something more haunting. These drawers contained visions that never came to be the abandoned designs of altarpieces, sculptures and fresco that the Church once considered but never allowed to leave the page. They were the lost masterpieces of the Church, preserved not as triumphs, but as cautionary ghosts. The first folder I opened bore the hand of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the towering genius of Baroque Rome. known for sculpting saints who seemed to breathe and angels who seemed to move. Bernini transformed space into spectacle. His works scattered across Rome blur the boundary between art and worship. Yet here, in brittle sketches, was a design of his that history never saw. It was a proposal for an altar inside St. Peter's Basilica. The drawing showed spiraling columns reaching heavenward, crowned by angels leaning down, as though ready to step into the congregation. Hidden windows in the dome above were meant to send shafts of light across the altar at certain shows, making it glow as if heaven itself had caught fire. Even as a sketch, it pulsed with grandeur. But the attached letters revealed a dispute that stifled it. Some cardinals praised the design as a theater of glory, a stage where heaven could be made visible. Others recoiled, calling it a distraction, a spectacle that would draw awe to stone instead of God. Their words bristle with unease. The faithful will see theater before they see divinity. The debate was fierce, circling between theology and aesthetics. Bernini's altar, they feared, would inspire drama rather than devotion. In the end, the design was shelved. The basilica left magnificent, but without this imagined burst of light and motion. Bernini's altar lives only in pencil lines, confined to paper in a locked drawer. Another folder revealed the ghost of a fresco conceived during the Counter-Reformation. The artist, whose name has faded from the documents, envisioned a mural where angels descended in fire, devils writhed in shadow, and saints stood like pillars amidst collapsing empires. The intention was to stir awe, even dread, a vision of faith forged in storm. But the committee reviewing it balked. These images inspire fear more than devotion. One note insisted, another argued the opposite. That fear was necessary to awaken the lukewarm. The debate circled until the decision was made. No fresco. The wall it was meant to cover was left blank, its silence standing where flame might have burned. Today, visitors walk past that wall without pause, never knowing what visions it might have carried. The most haunting sketch of all showed Christ not enthroned or triumphant, but slumped beneath the weight of the cross, his body bent, his head bowed, his divinity veiled by exhaustion. The lines of the drawing revealed a savior, close to breaking, yet still moving forward. The reviewers could not bear it. Too human, they wrote. The faithful must see divinity, not weakness. The sculpture was never carved, but looking at the sketch, I saw no diminishment, only solidarity. The Christ who suffers with us, who bends as we bend. It was a truth, too raw for its time, and so it was silenced, preserved only in shadow. From the 19th century came another bold vision. An artist proposed a grand mural of the church, depicted as a storm-tossed ship. Its sails were ripped, its masts shattered. Apostles clung to ropes in terror, while Christ stood at the center, calm, but small against the storm. The symbolism was sharp. The church survives not by triumph, but by grace. Fragile yet afloat, the reviewers refused it. Too destabilizing, their margin note declared. The faithful must not see the church as weak, lest their confidence falter. The mural was shelved, the walls left bare. Yet the irony is stark. By rejecting vulnerability, the church revealed its own fragility. The image of a battered ship remains locked away, yet it speaks louder in silence than it ever could on plaster. One of the simplest sketches struck me most deeply. It was a drawing of Mary, not as Queen of Heaven crowned in light, but as a young mother seated on a plain stool, holding her child with weary arms. Her hair hung loose, her clothes were simple, her eyes heavy with fatigue. The reviewer dismissed it with 2 words, too ordinary. Yet in that ordinariness lay something extraordinary. It showed holiness in tenderness, divinity in exhaustion, sanctity in the smallness of daily love. But the Church chose majesty instead, leaving this vision of Mary hidden in a folder, her humanity too daring to display. The more I read, the more I saw a pattern. These works were not abandoned for lack of talent. They were silenced because they spoke truths the Church was not ready to proclaim. They showed Christ too weary, Mary too human, the Church too fragile. They asked questions the institution feared. Can holiness exist in weakness? Can majesty be found in fatigue? Can faith tremble and still be faith? Art, after all, is theology made visible. To depict Christ exhausted is to preach that divinity bends with us. To show Mary weary is to teach that holiness dwells in ordinary motherhood. To paint the Church as storm-tossed is to admit it survives by grace, not triumph. These truths were not denied, but they were postponed, suspended in sketches, waiting for courage. What haunts me is that the Vatican did not destroy these works. It preserved them carefully. They were filed, catalogued, protected, as if waiting for another time. Perhaps the Church knew they carried truths too real to discard. Perhaps the archive itself is not only a treasury of triumph, but a confession of fear. To walk among these lost masterpieces is to feel the ache of absence. They remind us that the history of sacred art is not only Michelangelo's dome or Bernini, angels. It is also sketches hidden in drawers, visions too human to reveal. Their silence speaks louder than stone. Closing the final folder, I felt the chamber breathe again. These were not failures of art, they were failures of courage, and yet their very survival transforms them into witnesses. They whisper of a Christ who suffers, a Mary who tires, a Church that trembles. They remind us that beauty is not always safe, and truth not always welcome. Perhaps the greatest masterpieces are not those displayed in marble and gold, but those preserved in secret, waiting for a future that can finally bear them. The deliberate absence of modernity. In most of the Vatican archive, history feels heavy but continuous. You can follow the centuries like stepping stones across a river. Papal decrees, councils, diplomatic letters, theological debates. One era flows into the next, a tapestry woven of both faith and fear. But there is a curious break in that fabric, a silence that does not come from loss or decay, but from design. It is the silence of the modern world. The longer I worked in the archive, the more I began to notice what was not there. No mention of electricity, no real acknowledgement of the arrival of telegraph lines, railways, or airplanes. Whole categories of 20th century innovation, cinema, radio, computers, the internet simply never appear. It is as though the Vatican, at least within its archival memory, drew a deliberate curtain at the edge of modernity and refused to let it in. This absence is not ignorance. The Church was never blind to change. It knew the world was shifting. Popes gave speeches about workers' rights during the Industrial Revolution. They issued cautious statements about the moral dangers of cinema or the need to regulate radio, broadcasting. But when you search the archive, these references vanish into euphemism. There are no raw files cataloging the debates about electricity, lighting, cathedrals, no ledgers weighing whether film could carry the gospel, no transcripts of bishops wrestling with the early internet. Instead, there are vague pastoral notes. Encourage the faithful to remain steadfast amidst novelty, or guard against influences that distract from eternal truth. It is as though the Vatican decided that modernity was too fleeting, too profane, too unworthy to be preserved beside the timeless. And in that decision lies a paradox, for what is deliberately excluded speaks as loudly as what is kept. One example comes from the records surrounding the First Vatican Council in the late 19th century. Europe was already deep in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Railways crisscrossed the continent. Factories belched smoke. Cities grew swollen with workers. Intellectuals of the day wrote endlessly about the transformation of human life through machines. And yet in the archives accounts of the Council, the words industrial and machine are almost entirely absent. Instead, the files speak of pastoral challenges and the duty to guard against worldly distraction. The omission is glaring. Where others saw an age of machines, the archive frames it only as an age of temptation. Another absence reveals itself in the files from the early 20th century. The world was reeling from the invention of cinema. Movies spread rapidly, carrying stories, images, and ideas across borders. Governments worried about propaganda. Artists celebrated a new language of vision. Yet in the Vatican Archive, there is no direct engagement with film as art, no analysis of its cultural power. Instead, the language remains evasive. Moving pictures may influence the young. Bishops must remind the faithful to preserve modesty and discipline. The words are careful, cautious, but never concrete. It is as though the archive intentionally avoided placing modern inventions into its sacred memory. Even more striking is the silence around electricity. Cathedrals were lit by candles and oil lamps for centuries. The arrival of electric light transformed worship, making it possible for masses to be held in radiant brightness long after sunset. One would expect the Vatican to have preserved debates over such a profound shift. Surely some argued that electric light diminished the sacred aura of candle flame, while others saw it as a gift of progress. Yet in the archive, those arguments are nowhere to be found. The ledges of cathedral maintenance stopped just before the first electric fixtures were reinstalled, as though the matter itself was beneath record. The light changed, but the memory of change was erased. The absence becomes even more deliberate in later decades. Radio transformed the 20th century. Yet the Vatican's files speak of it only in terms of new means of proclamation, without ever naming frequencies, broadcasters, or controversies. By the time the Internet appeared, the omission was absolute. The archive's categories end abruptly at the edge of analog. The digital world never enters the room. What is preserved instead are pastoral exhortations about timelessness. Repeated phrases appear. The truth of God is not bound to novelty. The eternal must not be confused with the transient. What is fleeting cannot weigh upon the memory of the Church. It is as though the archive itself is curated not only to preserve what happened, but to enforce what the Church wishes to appear eternal. As I sat among these silences, I wondered what future historians will see. They will find meticulous accounts of medieval councils, records of theological debates from centuries past, detailed descriptions of plagues and wars. But they will not find the Church wrestling with the electric age, the atomic age, or the digital age. Well, those eras will appear only as faint shadows, hinted at through cautious euphemism. The absence is not accidental. It is an act of self-protection. By excluding modernity, the Vatican curates its own identity as timeless. To record electricity, cinema, or the Internet in detail would be to admit that the Church too was shaped by them. Better to remain silent, to let modernity pass by, without leaving fingerprints on parchment. In that silence, the Church sustains its self-image as something that transcends time, but the silence also creates fragility, for what is emitted does not disappear. It lingers like a ghost at the edge of the record. When I searched for references to the Second World War, I found detailed notes about diplomacy, about prayers, about suffering. But when I searched for the word radio, there was nothing. Yet it was through radio that so many prayers and speeches traveled. The medium is absent. The message remains. The gap itself becomes a kind of confession. In the margins of one folder, I found a curious note written by an anonymous archivist in the mid-20th century. It said, "We preserve eternity by excluding the present." That sentence chilled me. It revealed the philosophy behind the silence. The Vatican Archive is not a neutral memory. It is a curated one, sculpted to remind the world that the Church stands above the flux of invention. And yet, as I closed the folders, I wondered whether this exclusion will one day betray its purpose. For what happens when the silence itself becomes the loudest sound? Future generations will not find ignorance here. They will find deliberate gaps, voids where modernity should be. They will see not a Church untouched by time, but a Church that chose to turn its face away. The chamber devoted to art revealed sketches too human to display. The chamber of suspended acts revealed truths too dangerous to proclaim. And here, in the chamber of deliberate absence, the Vatican reveals something subtler, but just as haunting, that sometimes silence is chosen not to hide sin, but to protect identity. The archive becomes less a record of what happened, and more a monument to how the Church wishes to be remembered. As I left that section of the archive, I looked back once more at the drawers. They seemed strangely blank, their labels vague, their folders thin. It was not neglect, it was design. And in that design, I realized something. The Vatican's greatest fear is not heresy, nor even scandal. Its greatest fear is impermanence. By excluding modernity, it clings to eternity. By refusing to record the transient, it insists that its story is one that stands outside time. But the silence itself will testify. In centuries to come, when scholars open these drawers and find only euphemisms where there should be details, they will understand. They will see that even eternity, when curated, carries the fingerprints of fear. The archive whispers that the Church has always walked a knife's edge between preservation and eraser, between memory and forgetting. And in that fragile balance lies the truth. That silence, even deliberate silence, is never empty. It is its own confession. The children of the papal household. When most people imagine the Vatican, they picture solemn halls filled with cardinals in crimson, ancient libraries guarded by silence, and pontiffs moving with ceremonial gravity. But tucked away in the archive is a set of folders that reveal something very different. The story of children who once lived and served within the papal household. It is a story of innocence pressed into service, of laughter turned to whispers, of young lives molded by ritual and duty long before they had time to grow. The files are marked with the phrase, Papal Apostolic, the boys of the Apostolic Palace. At first glance, the folders look unremarkable, stacks of thin reports, letters tied with faded ribbon, a few scraps of parchment, no larger than a hand. But once opened, they reveal a world rarely imagined, the lives of pages, altar boys, and young attendants who grew up inside the Vatican itself. Their names rarely appear in official histories, but here, their voices survive fragile, homesick, sometimes joyful, sometimes broken. The practice of bringing children into papal service stretches back centuries. Noble families often offered their sons to the Church, seeing in it both honor and opportunity. Some boys were destined for the priesthood, others for political favor, but all were drawn into a world where childhood was not a season of play, but of discipline. From the age of 7 or 8, they were dressed in livery, taught to walk in careful steps, and drilled in the art of silence. Their lives became the echo of ceremony. One folder contains the letters of a boy named Matteo, who entered service in the early 17th century. His first letter is filled with excitement. He describes the awe of walking through the apostolic palace, where ceilings soared like heaven itself and the air smelled faintly of incense. He tells his parents how proud he felt to carry messages for a cardinal, how thrilling it was to see the Pope himself passing by in procession. His words are filled with wonder, but as the months pass, his tone changes. He begins to write of loneliness. He misses the sound of his sister's laughter, the warmth of the family hearth, the ordinary noise of village life. Here he writes, "Even when many walk, it is quiet, as though the walls swallow every word." That sentence captures the essence of these children's world. The Vatican, filled with grandeur, was also filled with silence. Boys who longed to run and shout found themselves trained to move like shadows. Joy was measured, laughter suppressed, softness discouraged. Even kindness could be punished. In one disciplinary report, a boy was reprimanded not for misbehavior, but for showing excessive tenderness toward a sick servant. He had refused to leave the man's side, holding his hand as he lay fevered. The margin note is chilling. Too much softness. The boy must learn severity if he is to serve. It is hard to imagine a harsher reversal. What the boy offered as compassion was treated as weakness. In the world of the Apostolic Palace, even children were expected to learn the hardness of ceremony. The Church believed discipline forged holiness. Yet in these records, you see how discipline often crushed gentleness instead. Still, not all the stories are bleak. Some boys found ways to carve small sanctuaries for themselves. The records speak of music as a refuge. Pages were sometimes allowed to practice the organ or to sing in chapels after duties were done. Their voices, echoing through marble halls, offered fleeting warmth against the cold of discipline. Others turned to books, sneaking volumes of Virgil or Dante into their chambers, reading by candlelight until their eyes blurred. One report describes a pair of boys caught whispering poetry late at night. Their punishment was minor, but the note in the margin reveals more than intended. They seek beauty, where they are told to seek silence. What moves me most in these documents is the persistence of humanity. Even in the strictest halls, children found ways to laugh, to be kind, to dream. One boy doodled birds in the margins of his Latin exercises, clumsy sketches of wings and feathers. Another folded paper into crude boats, hiding them in the cracks of a chapel bench. Small rebellions, gestures of childhood refusing to be extinguished. The archive preserves not only letters and reports, but also fragments of testimony from confessors and tutors. These adults often describe the boys clinically as though they were molding marble into statues. One tutor praised a boy for his composure, noting that he had stood through an entire mass without shifting once. Another scolded a page for weeping after receiving a reprimand, calling it a sign of weakness unbecoming of future clergy. These judgments read coldly now, but they reveal the harsh expectations placed on children who were meant to serve not just the Pope, but the image of the Church itself. One of the most poignant letters I encountered was unsigned, written in a child's uneven hand. It reads, "They say we are chosen to serve, but I think we are chosen to be silent. I pray God hears children, for here no one else does." The honesty of that sentence lingers. In a palace built to proclaim the word, the smallest voices felt unheard. And yet, even amid the weight of silence, there are glimpses of tenderness. A report from the 18th century describes how during Christmas, the boys were allowed to sing carols together in a chapel. For one night, discipline softened into celebration. Their voices rose, not in whispers, but in joy. The tutor noted dryly, "The boys were allowed cheer, but between the lines, you can sense the relief, the fleeting happiness of children, allowed to be children." The lives of these boys remind us that the Vatican, for all its grandeur, was also a place of hidden sacrifice. Childhood itself was offered at the altar of ceremony. Families may have dreamed of honor, of advancement, but the children themselves bore the cost. Their innocence was shaped into ritual, their longings pressed into silence. The Church called it discipline, but the letters reveal another truth, the ache of children learning to be holy before they had learned to be human. What happened to them after their service ended is often left unrecorded. Some rose through the ranks of the Church, becoming priests, bishops, even popes. Others left quietly, disappearing into obscurity. The archive rarely follows them beyond childhood. Their later lives vanish, as though their worth was measured only while they served in silence. Yet even in their absence, the traces remain: the small voices caught in letters, the doodles, the pleas for home. Reading these documents, I found myself asking questions the records themselves never dared to ask. What is the cost of holiness if it silences kindness? What happens when compassion is punished as weakness? Can a church that calls itself a mother, truly mother, those children who grow within its walls? These are questions unanswered, left suspended in ink. But by preserving the records, the Vatican admits they existed. The silence becomes a confession of its own. As I closed the folders, I could almost hear those children still the shuffle of their small shoes on marble floors. The faint hum of a hymn whispered when no one listened. The sighs of boys staring through narrow windows at skies they long to run beneath. History does not remember them. Their names are absent from monuments. Yet here in these fragile pages, they endure not as saints or rulers, but as children whose voices remind us that even in the heart of power, innocence lingers, fragile and often unheard. The Vatican preserved their memory, not to glorify them, but perhaps because it could not erase them. Their lives, though small, are threads in the tapestry of faith, and in the archive silence, they speak still, whispering of homes left behind, of kindness mistaken for weakness, of laughter swallowed by marble halls. They remind us that holiness can ask too much, that even palaces echo with longing, and that the truest memory of faith is not only in triumph, but in the fragile humanity of children who once walked its corridors. The Village Chronicles. In the labyrinth of the Vatican Archive, one drawer drew me, not by grandeur, but by humility. Its label written in faded ink read simply, Chronica Villarum, the Chronicles of the Villages. I opened it, expecting statistics, dry reports of taxes or sacramental registers. What I found instead were fragile voices from the margins of history, letters, testimonies, and chronicles sent from rural parishes across medieval and early modern Europe. These were not the proclamations of popes or the arguments of theologians. They were the stories of peasants and priests, of families who lived by the seasons, whose faith was as hard as the soil they tilled, and whose sufferings were bound to the silence of distant Rome. The documents were often crude, their handwriting uneven, their ink blotched by rain or sweat. Many were written on scraps of parchment or rough paper, the cheapest a parish could afford. And yet within them lies a history. No cathedral can tell a history of famine, plague, joy, doubt, and faith lived not in the courts of kings, but in fields and cottages. One letter from a French priest in the 14th century begins bluntly, "The people are starving, and they ask where God has gone." He describes fields struck by blight, families boiling weeds for food, children wasting away before his eyes. He writes of the prayers he leads daily, of processions through the fields with relics held high, of bells rung to drive away despair, but the heavens are silent. He confesses the faithful kneel, but the earth gives no bread. His letter is part plea, part accusation, sent to Rome, not for doctrine, but for aid. The archive contains no record of a reply. Another chronicle comes from an English village ravaged by an outbreak of plague. The priest records the deaths with grim precision. Entire families buried within a week. Church bells tolling so often that their sound became part of the air itself. He notes how suspicion crept into the village neighbors, blaming neighbors. Whispers of sin and punishment. In one entry he writes, "The people fear not only death but each other. A mother refuses to nurse her child. A brother refuses to bury his sister. Charity has grown thin as the grave fills thick." These are not the words of a theologian. They are the cries of a man watching his community unravel. What struck me most about these chronicles is their honesty. They do not hide doubt. One priest writes simply, "I do not know if heaven listens. I pray because I must, but I pray with trembling hands." Another account describes villagers who began to question whether their suffering was punishment or abandonment. The Church has often been portrayed as offering certainty in times of crisis, but these records reveal a more complex truth. Faith in the villages was not unshakable. It was fragile, held together by ritual and hope, often strained to the breaking point. And yet, amid the despair, there are also glimpses of resilience. A letter from a German parish describes how during a harsh winter, the villagers gathered not in the church, but in a barn, huddled together for warmth, singing hymns by candlelight. The priest notes that their voices grew stronger with each verse, as though the act of singing itself became a kind of bread. Another chronicle from Italy recounts a harvest festival held after years of famine. The people processed through the fields, carrying loaves of bread, lifting them like relics, blessing them as though they were sacraments. In these moments, faith was not abstract theology. It was survival, given meaning. Some chronicles are almost unbearably tender. One entry from a Spanish village describes a father carving a small wooden cross for his daughter who had died of fever. He placed it in the earth and told the priest, "If heaven takes her, let heaven also see. She had a father who loved her." Another record from Poland tells of villagers who, after burying their dead, planted flowers on the graves, not as ornament, but as defiance. "If death surrounds us, let beauty bloom louder." The Vatican preserved these chronicles not because they were grand, but because they were real. They reveal the Church not as an institution of marble and gold, but as a fragile thread woven through the daily suffering of ordinary lives. In the voices of priests and peasants, you hear the raw texture of faith. Faith not as certainty, but as endurance. Theologically, these chronicles are astonishing. They show that faith in the villages was less about doctrine than about presence. The people needed to know not what was true in theory, but whether God was with them in the dark. The priests, in turn, struggled with the same questions. Their letters reveal not triumphant declarations, but trembling prayers. One priest writes, "If I tell them God is silent, they despair. If I tell them God is near, I lie. So I tell them both, and I kneel beside them in the cold." That sentence carries more theology than any council decree. It reveals faith not as a fortress, but as a tent pitched in a storm. As I read, I realized these chronicles preserve not only suffering, but also memory. They were written not only for Rome, but for posterity. As though the priests and villagers knew their lives would otherwise vanish, they wrote so that their hunger, their fear, their fragile hope would not be forgotten. The Vatican, by preserving them, honored that wish. These are not the histories of kings. They are the histories of the forgotten remembered in ink. Closing the folder, I felt an ache different from that of grand debates or papal doubts. This was the ache of humanity itself, the small, persistent cry of people who wanted only to live, to eat, to be remembered. Their faith was not in cathedrals or councils. It was in bread baked in hunger, hymns sung in barns, flowers planted on graves. The village chronicles remind us that the story of the Church is not only written in marble, halls, it is also written in mud and sweat, in fields and fires, in letters scrolled by hands too tired to hold the pen steady. They remind us that faith does not belong only to popes and cardinals. It belongs to peasants who prayed with trembling, to priests who confessed their doubts in ink, to families who carved crosses out of grief. And in that reminder lies their true power. For history often forgets the poor, the hungry, the small. But the archive does not. It keeps their voices, their cries, their fragile hope. And in keeping them, it confesses something profound, that the Church itself is built not only on doctrine, but on the faith of those who endured, who doubted, who planted flowers over graves, and still believed beauty mattered. The final vault. There is at the very back of the archive a chamber with no label. It is small compared to the vast halls of ledgers and cabinets, no larger than a chapel sacristy. The air there feels different, cooler, stiller, as though centuries of silence have condensed into its walls. Inside is no single drawer or shelf, but a collection of boxes stacked with deliberate care. Their tags are vague. Memoranda, fragmenta scriptura, sine titulo, memoranda fragments writings without title. Opening them is like walking into the very heart of memory itself. They hold not decrees, not councils, not trials, but scraps, half-finished letters, unfinished prayers, fragments of testimonies too small to catalogue elsewhere, a page torn from a diary, a note scribbled in the margin of a sermon, a confession written on the back of a receipt. None of them alone tells a story, yet together they reveal something greater. The soul of the Church caught not in proclamation, but in hesitation. Finished sentence. I believe, but, and nothing more. Sign, believe. But, sign, sand, and, nothing more. There is a child's doodle of a dove in the corner of a page, otherwise filled with formal script. There is a sheet of music, with notes scratched out, as though the melody itself had been deemed too sorrowful. These are not documents of doctrine, They are documents of humanity, left unfinished, yet preserved, as though even Incomp's completion has holiness. What struck me as I turned these fragments over was how deliberately they had been kept. Someone centuries ago decided that even what was broken, unfinished, or abandoned deserved memory. The Vatican, often accused of secrecy here, reveals a different face. Not the face of eraser, but of witness. Even silence, even doubt, even failure is recorded not to condemn, but to remember. In that final vault, the entire archive seemed to gather into one truth. The Church has always walked a line between speaking and not speaking, between revealing and concealing. Its history is not only the triumph of councils and the majesty of basilicas, but also the trembling prayers of peasants, the unsent letters of popes, the uncarved sketches of artists, the silenced compassion of children. The archive holds them all. And perhaps that is the greatest secret of the Vatican archives. Not that they hide conspiracies, but that they preserve fragility. They do not protect the powerful from history. They protect history itself from being consumed too soon. They keep memory like wine sealed in a cellar, waiting for a generation strong enough to taste it. Walking out of the archive for the last time, I felt its silence follow me. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of endurance. A silence that said, "We have kept these truths safe. They will wait, and when you are ready, they will speak." The Vatican secrets are not locked to keep them hidden. They are locked because some truths are too heavy to be shouted, too fragile to be left in the streets. They are whispered in fragments, preserved in shadows, entrusted not to the present, but to the future. And so in the end, the archive is not a vault of darkness. It is a cathedral of silence, a place where history itself kneels, where unfinished prayers rest like relics, and where even the smallest voices are remembered. The final vault teaches us that secrecy is not always deception. Sometimes it is reverence. Sometimes it is love. Sometimes it is the only way to hold the unbearable without breaking.